budgetary discipline and strengthening our financial health and restoring the fiscal health of our nation, which is in rapid decline. I'd like to welcome our panel of expert witnesses and friends, the Honorable David Walker, the 7th Comptroller General of the United States from 1998 to 2008, Mr. Kurt Couchman, a Senior Fellow in Fiscal Policy for Americans for Prosperity, Ms. Romina Boccia, is that how you say it, Boccia? Romina, good to see you, she's Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute, and Dr. Douglas Elmendorf. Dr. Elmendorf, welcome. He's a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the Director of Congressional Budget Office from January 2009 through March of 2015. Again, thank you all for being here. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of the agenda, I would like to recognize our colleagues who have served with us over the last Congress who will be retiring. That's Representative Michael Burgess, by the way. Keep him in your prayers as he lost his daughter recently. He was the chairman of the Rules Committee and will be going back home to Texas. And Drew Ferguson, one of my best buddies, we're going to miss him. Greg Lopez, who's been an outstanding new member. I think the only guy that's read the 1974 Budget Act multiple times and quotes it. That will be missed, Greg. Earl Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer is not here. I was going to tell him that my last conversation with GT Thompson, our ag chairman, was about farm program reforms, and I've been dogged about that because I've heard him say, if you're going to reform SNAP, put safeguards for against abuses there, you better do it for that farmers too, because it happens there. And you know what? It's changed how I've operated and for the better for our country, and I'm grateful to Mr. Blumenauer. Plus, I have his office now, so I have to be nice to him. Dan Kildee, what a great guy. We've done some good things together on Ways and Means. Yeah. Miss Barbara Lee, got to travel to Africa with her. She's a wonderful member, will be missed. Jennifer Wexton, a profile encouraged, no doubt. And then Mr. David Trone, grateful for your service, each and every one of you, and we'll miss you a great deal. Let's give it up for our members who have. Okay, well, now for the business at hand. I haven't made a New Year's resolution to not take all 5 minutes, but I think we can make this pretty quick. We've got major fiscal problems, completely unsustainable fiscal trajectory. I think I haven't heard anyone, Democrat or Republican witness or member that doesn't accept that fact. I think it's very scary because we won't know when the dominoes fall on us in a sovereign debt crisis, which would be the big sort of cliff effect. But once it happens, it's going to be really difficult to put the pieces back together and maintain our global leadership. So a lot's at stake, not the least of which is our children's future. So we want to be about the people's business in regards to fiscal stewardship, fiscal sanity, and creating a culture, quite frankly, not just changing policies and procedures, but have a culture where we hold ourselves accountable for putting this nation on a path to not just prosperity, but again, financial sustainability, and they're interconnected, obviously. We're getting out of the box a little bit here. We're going to talk about fiscal responsibility procedures, policies, and even constitutional provisions, not just in the United States, that have been bandied about for years, and there are no doubt as many probably skeptics as there are supporters of constitutional amendments, Mr. Couchman. But there are other similar mechanisms that have been put in place in Switzerland and Germany. In Germany, I think it's a deficit to GDP trigger. And It seems to work in some places. States, 49 of the 50, I think, have some form of a balanced budget requirement. But there are states that blow right past those mechanisms, and they're in as much financial trouble as the United States, even so. And then there are some who operate responsibly. So I wrote this quote down that I think everybody's going to love. And it's as much about human nature as it is about our republic. In the question of power, and I believe that Thomas Jefferson is the one who said this, in the question of power, let no more be heard of the confidence of man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. And I think that's our biggest challenge, quite frankly. It's the nature of man. It's our weak flesh on both sides to not do the tough things, but the necessary things to make sure that we act responsibly. Bless you. So can we tighten the chains? Can we strengthen the chains? Can we add some links to the chains that would bind the mischief of the human nature that is manifested and expressed, at least in this regards, in irresponsible, not so courageous, and very inconsiderate, by the way, of our children's future behavior? I think this is a moral imperative to right this ship before it sinks and not just takes down America's influence and leadership, but again, robs our children of their freedom, their opportunities, and a future prosperity in the United States of America, the greatest country in human history. That's why this is an A committee. And when I ran for chair again, I said that, ranking member, you're awfully close to this gavel, so I know you feel the same. But this is an A committee. We deal with A problems, and we're going to have an epic A-like catastrophe if we don't work together to solve them. So thanks for being here. Those are my comments. And now the ranking member, I yield 5 minutes for you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing today. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. And as this Congress comes to a close, and I believe this will be the last time we're together this year, I also want to take a moment to recognize the contributions of members on both sides, especially those who will be departing Congress at the end of this session, including Barbara Lee, Dan Kildee, Earl Blumenauer, Jennifer Wexton, and David Trone on the Democratic side, and Michael Burgess, Drew Ferguson, and Greg Lopez on the Republican side. Greg, it's nice to meet you, and also goodbye. Thank you. Happens quickly, doesn't it? I also want to just take a moment and give special recognition to two others who began this Congress with us on the committee. One is Brian Higgins, who left Congress earlier this year, as well, of course, as Sheila Jackson Lee, who sat right at the end of that row and was such a powerful voice in this committee and in Congress. We tragically lost her in July, but certainly her legacy to public service is not forgotten. Hear, hear. Now, I also want to take a moment, as we're at the end of this year, to look back on where we were just 4 years ago, or really, I would say 5 years ago, at the beginning of 2020. We were just beginning the COVID pandemic, the deadliest event in American history by far. More than 1 million Americans lost their lives, double the death toll from the Civil War and triple the death toll from World War II. We were in shambles in terms of our economy. We were flat on our back with millions of Americans out of work, and economists were predicting high unemployment for years to come. Some were even predicting high inflation for the rest of the decade. But thanks to our policies, our economy has staged the world's leading recovery. Since 2021, we have created more than 16 million jobs. That is 7 million more jobs than the pre-COVID peak, which was in February 2020, right before the pandemic began. So we've recovered all of the jobs lost through the pandemic and added 7 million more on top of that. In terms of inflation, despite the fact there were those predicting that it would take a massive amount of unemployment in order to tame it, not so. Inflation has been tamed from a peak of 9% in the summer of 2022 to now roughly 2.5%. And in terms of our economic growth, it was 2.5% last year. Remember, there were some Wall Street firms, one of which even predicted, quote, a 100% chance of a recession. Well, they were 100% wrong. Now, we know that there's still work to be done. There are still many American families that are dealing with the economic ramifications from the pandemic and the inflation that came with it. So we still, to be clear, have work to do. But it is worth reflecting and taking a moment that there is not a country on earth that wouldn't trade places with our economy in a heartbeat if they had the opportunity to do so. Now, looking beyond just the next year and the next couple years, we do have, as we have both talked about, Mr. Chairman, in this committee a number of times, we do have some long-term structural issues that demand our attention. An aging population is increasing costs for programs like Social Security and Medicare, programs millions of Americans depend on for a dignified retirement. Widespread income inequality is leaving our economy more vulnerable to downturns and economic shocks. And this is where we will disagree, I think, 2 decades of Republican tax cuts have exploded our national debt. We have heard testimony in this committee during this term that we are missing $10 trillion in revenue cumulatively just because of the tax cuts we have had ever since 2001. I don't think the response to those long-term structural issues and our rising national debt is to compound those issues with a new $4.6 trillion in debt because of extending the tax cuts in the TCJA for another decade. Unfortunately, that is what some are proposing. If we really want to get serious about dealing with our long-term structural challenges and dealing with our national debt, the very last thing we should do is add $4.6 trillion to our national debt. And that's not my figure. That is exactly the CBO estimate on what the extension of the TCJA tax cuts would cost. So I look forward to this hearing. I see I'm already half a minute over my time. So I'll just conclude with this. Mr. Chairman, congratulations, not only on your reelection to Congress, but your reelection as chairman of this committee. It has truly been a pleasure the last 2 years working with you, my friend, and I look forward to getting to do so again for another 2 years. With that, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. Feelings are mutual. By the way, for everybody, 17 bills passed out of this committee, 11 bipartisans, never happened before here. And one of them became law, your bill. Grateful to everybody's hard work. Now let's introduce, let me say that in the interest of time, any member that has an opening statement can submit it for the record, and we'll hold the record open at the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have yet prepared a statement. Again, thank you, witnesses, for being here, for your time and insight. We're going to start with Mr. Walker. We yield 5 minutes to you, sir, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the House Budget Committee. Appreciate the opportunity to testify. I would like for my entire statement to be included in the record.
So ordered.
To summarize. Thank you. Now that the elections are over, we need to focus on how to put our nation's finances in order to avoid a domestic and global debt crisis. As I've said for many years, the federal government has grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, undercut states' rights, and lost control of the budget. Shockingly, despite existing for almost 250 years, the federal government still does not have a comprehensive, integrated, and outcome-based strategic plan, despite a legislative mandate to have one. The related plans should be designed to produce specific outcome-based results consistent with the role and responsibilities assigned to the federal government under the Constitution. It should also focus on providing real value to the American people for the money it spends and the other activities it engages in. Adopting these elements is essential if we want our future to be better than our past. Every major federal fiscal and monetary agency has stated for years that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path, which was reinforced last week by Fed Chairman Powell. Failure to change course, restructure our nation's finances, and transform the federal government's operations will have serious adverse economic security, national security, diplomatic, and domestic tranquility consequences over time. I trust that everybody on this committee understands the seriousness and importance of this issue. Therefore, I'll focus on what I think needs to be done to address it. First, Congress needs to pass the fiscal 2025 appropriations bills. In doing so, spending should be reduced from the bloated levels of 2024 in several areas, and I give several examples in my testimony. Second, President-elect Trump recently announced the creation of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE initiative. Based on information disclosed to date, it looks like it will be expanded and expedited external Grace Commission led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy with a reporting date of July 4, 2026. It is likely to focus on ways to right-size, reorganize, and modernize the federal government to improve its economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Examples could include eliminating, consolidating, and devolving selected organizations, facilities, functions, while leveraging technology, improving internal controls, reforming human capital and acquisition practices, and adopting major management principles, along with strengthening work requirements. It should also explore deregulation efforts and additional reorganization and empowerment authority with appropriate congressional control. The DOGE effort is clearly needed, and if properly designed and effectively implemented, could save several $100 billion a year, but nowhere close to $2 trillion a year. It should consider the work of the GAO and the Inspector Generals and coordinate its efforts with OMB. It should also seek input from experienced outside experts in government transformation and relevant congressional committees, including this committee. Importantly, additional steps beyond the DOGE will be needed in order to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability. There's no way that Congress can pass the much-needed and long overdue spending and tax reforms in a piecemeal fashion and in a timely manner and avoid the debt crisis. Therefore, we need to create a statutory fiscal sustainability commission that will meaningfully engage the American people, solicit input across the board: revenues, social insurance, defense and other spending, et cetera. Everything needs to be on the table. Everything is not equal. That needs to be done. This committee passed out a bipartisan bill in the spring, the Fiscal Commission Act of 2023. That needs to be moved. It needs some modifications. I include that in my testimony. Regarding fiscal sustainability, I've been to 47 states plus DC plus 2 territories doing citizen education engagement. They understand the need for reform. They're willing to support reform as long as it's based on a goal-based plan consistent with principles and values that bring people together rather than divide them apart. They believe that debt to GDP is the right thing to focus on. They believe that the problem is primarily a spending problem, but not exclusively. They support reforms weighted more towards spending reductions and revenue increases, but they recognize that both will be necessary because the hole's too deep. We've waited too long. Last, HCR 24, which the chairman introduced. The Congress has been delinquent since 1979 in calling a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment, despite an express, enumerated, non-discretionary ministerial responsibility under Article 5 of the Constitution. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to insert several things into the record that provide support for this. I'd also like to acknowledge Bruce Lee, who's here, who's the Executive Director of the Phoenix Correspondence Commission. The states are working together to hold a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment because the Congress has failed to act, and they're prepared to do it. In summary, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. But let me just say, we're at a critical crossroads. The future of our country and our families is at stake. And as the chairman said, what is going on now with regard to fiscal policy is irresponsible, unethical, immoral, and must stop. Thank you.
As we say in West Texas, amen. Mr. Lee, thank you for your leadership. Ms. Boccia, 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The fiscal health of the United States is at a critical juncture. I agree with my colleague on this. Rising debt and persistent deficits threaten to undermine our economic prosperity, national security, and the opportunities enjoyed by working Americans and their families. Without significant reforms, we risk a severe fiscal crisis that could diminish America's economic leadership and undermine our national security. There is still hope. History demonstrates that with the right institutional reforms, which we're here to talk about today, even the most challenging fiscal situations can be overcome. The US debt, now at about 100% of GDP, with annual deficits above 6% of GDP, is primarily driven by irresponsible emergency spending, unsustainable entitlement spending, including ever-increasing benefit levels for Social Security and Medicare beneficiaries that outpace inflation, and the rising cost of interest on our debt. As the debt grows, interest rates are getting pushed up. Interest payments now exceed what the government spends on defense. This constrains the government's ability to respond to the next major emergency or economic crisis. To address this spending-driven debt crisis, institutional reforms like a balanced budget amendment could serve as a critical commitment device to guide fiscal policy. A well-designed debt brake or balanced budget amendment would require Congress to balance revenues and expenditures over the business cycle. This would allow for flexibility during recessions or emergencies while ensuring long-term fiscal stability. Fiscal rules can succeed when they are sufficiently firm, necessarily flexible, and broadly supported. Switzerland's constitutional debt brake, for example, balances their budget based on economic conditions using spending caps. Any deviations from those spending caps are recorded in a compensation account, which then mandates future corrections. The debt brake has proven highly effective, reducing public debt relative to GDP to about 35% and fostering long-term fiscal stability while allowing for flexibility for emergencies and economic crises, but also requiring that those emergency expenditures will be paid back after the crisis concludes. Similarly, Germany's constitutional debt brake limits structural deficits. The framework allows for temporary suspension during crises, provided a repayment plan is established. There's oversight by an independent stability council to ensure accountability. And this rule, too, has helped to stabilize Germany's debt trajectory, even as it accommodated emergency spending during the pandemic. Lastly, in Sweden, they adopted a fiscal framework in the 1990s that has 3 key pillars: a surplus target over the business cycle, multi-year spending caps, and a debt anchor or debt stabilization target. These rules, too, are monitored by an independent fiscal policy council. Sweden's structural reforms, such as tying pension benefits to life expectancy and converting a portion of their Social Security to defined contribution plans, have complemented Sweden's fiscal rules, preserving its welfare state without bankrupting their nation. A balanced budget amendment alone cannot resolve our nation's fiscal challenges. It must be accompanied by credible reforms to entitlement programs and structural spending constraints. Congress might, for example, adopt a BRAC-like fiscal commission to propose reforms and overcome political gridlock. This would be a fiscal commission modeled after the successful Base Realignment and Closure Commission. It would provide independent recommendations based on clear and narrow congressional guidelines, such as stabilizing the debt at less than the size of the US economy or achieving primary balance by a certain year. The risks of continued inaction are profound, with credit rating agencies having warned of the dangers of political dysfunction and fiscal responsibility. We've now been downgraded twice by Standard & Poor's and Fitch, as Moody's has altered its outlook to negative for the United States credit. Worse, due to the unique nature of the US dollar as the world's preeminent reserve currency, bondholders may not be sending us early warning signals. In other words, we may be missing a canary in this coal mine, and we shouldn't find out where the fiscal cliff is by going over it, because as Reinhardt and Rogoff have noted in their book, This Time is Different, debt crises most often arise not from gradual decline, but from sudden collapse in investor confidence. Policymakers still have the opportunity to chart a new course by adopting a debt brake or balanced budget amendment and pursuing entitlement reforms, possibly by empowering a fiscal commission modeled after BRAC. International models like Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden show the way, but decisive action is needed now, here in the United States, to safeguard our republic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Boccia. Now we yield 5 minutes to Mr. Couchman.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and all members of the committee, thank you for continuing to consider systemic solutions to systemic problems. Controlling the debt burden can protect Americans from higher costs, expand opportunity, and defuse the threats to our prosperity, our security, and even our political system. Overwhelming support exists for the concept of budget balance, but designing a balanced budget amendment is challenging. So are complementary changes to statute. When the norm against non-emergency public debt frayed in the Great Depression, bipartisan support for balanced budget rules emerged in Congress. BBAs passed the Senate in 1982 and the House in 1995. Almost every state requires balanced operating budgets. Nearly all countries with advanced economies do too. 80% of Americans support a constitutional amendment that would require a balanced budget within 10 years. Most economists think balance should be done over the course of the business cycle rather than yearly. Today's growing debt burden, ongoing inflation and interest rate pressures, and increasing federal interest costs may promote bipartisan consensus to control the debt. To get the best results, Congress needs institutional upgrades that can also make America's legislature a better place to serve. Drafting BBA language is challenging. Annual balance is a common fatal flaw. Revenue is volatile. Tightly binding spending to revenue would drive policy instability, as Figure 1 in my written testimony shows. Fortunately, annual balance isn't necessary. Chairman Arrington's business cycle BBA defines a rolling average relationship between spending and revenue, while Representative Moran and Senator Braun's principles-based BBA would rely on implementing legislation for the details. Either would allow a smooth, predictable path for non-emergency budgets. Representative McClintock's debt limit amendment might as well, depending on definitions and reserve funds. Some BBAs exclude payment of debt from spending, so Congress could target full or primary balance. There's a big difference. Other BBAs require full balance, which implies much more deficit reduction. The Arrington and Moran BBAs use the term expenditures instead of outlays for spending. Expenditures is a general term, while outlays is statutory and would create big management challenges. Emergencies do happen, of course. The approval threshold should be high enough to limit abuse, yet low enough for Congress to address crises. 3/5, 2/3, and 3/4 are often proposed, but 2/3 is the most constitutionally consistent. Some BBAs have lower additional waivers, and some could even encourage kinetic military action. Beyond the ratification period, some BBAs would allow a full decade to reach balance. 5 years is also common, 2 less so, and 1 BBA would require balance upon ratification. Chairman Arrington's BBA uses declining fractions to reach balance. Others don't lay out a specific path. References to statute in the Constitution could prop up outdated approaches or let anachronisms accumulate, among other issues. Outlays is one example of a statutory reference. Another is the statutory debt limit. Maybe Congress wouldn't need it anymore, but maybe it could help with automatic enforcement. The president's annual budget request is another, with risks of changing the balance of powers. Some provisions are simply fatal to reaching 2/3 support in Congress, among other issues. They include supermajorities to increase revenue or to exceed a spending to GDP ratio, as well as excluding Social Security and Medicare. Covering all programs in a BBA does not mean that Congress must treat them equally or that automatic enforcement must apply equally. Courts are an important part of our system of checks and balances, yet fiscal policy is inherently legislative. That said, Congress living up to a BBA may be the surest way to keep courts from stepping in, even if statute cannot fully constrain them. An approved or ratified BBA could push Congress to overhaul the broken budget process through the national consensus-building exercise of approving and ratifying a BBA. Ultimately, Congress needs an annual budget process that starts on time, ends on time, and in the meantime, lets all members contribute. It should encourage collaboration, unleash creativity, and help Congress address all kinds of challenges. Restoring the balance norm has overwhelming public support, and new BBAs resolve longstanding design problems. With a BBA and related statutory changes, bottom-up bipartisan deal-making within an effective budget process can make America's future brighter than ever. My written testimony expands on these themes, which I asked to be included in the record,
So ordered.
and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Couchman. Dr. Elmendorf, 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and all the members of the committee. It's great to be back with the Budget Committee, and I appreciate the invitation to testify today. I'm pleased the committee is hosting this hearing about the need for significant changes in the federal budget. Let me make 3 basic points. First, current fiscal policies regarding spending and revenues are almost certainly unsustainable. Federal debt is now roughly equal to the nation's annual output, or gross domestic product, as you can see in this too familiar picture. That is nearly the highest level in our history and almost 3 times the level in 2007 before the global financial crisis. More importantly, the Congressional Budget Office's projections based on current law show debt rising continuously relative to GDP in the years ahead. As debt rises, interest rates will rise, so interest payments by the federal government would rise continuously as well. Those trends cannot, in fact, continue indefinitely. Therefore, policies will need to be changed. My second point is that we are not in a fiscal crisis now, and changes do not need to be made urgently, but acting sooner rather than later would be valuable and prudent. A key sign of a fiscal crisis would be interest rates rising well above their typical levels. We have not seen that. As this picture shows, even with the increase in interest rates over the past few years, the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, a benchmark for this kind of analysis, remains lower now than almost any time between 1990 and 2007. So we are not in a crisis now. Nonetheless, delaying action has significant costs. The accumulation of debt crowds out capital investment, which holds down wages and pushes up interest rates relative to what would happen otherwise. The accumulation of debt also limits the government's ability to borrow when truly needed to respond to problems in the future. And the accumulation of debt increases the risk that we will face a fiscal crisis at some point in which investors are unwilling to hold Treasury securities at reasonable interest rates. My third point is that putting fiscal policy on a sustainable path should include both tax increases and spending reductions. Stabilizing the ratio of debt to GDP at its current level over the next 30 years would require policy changes totaling a little more than 2% of GDP, which amounts to about $600 billion per year today. If all the expiring provisions of the 2017 tax cut were extended with no pay-fors, the fiscal hole would be that much deeper. So cutting spending that much would require large cuts to popular and important government programs, and raising taxes that much would require large tax increases for many people. So the only realistic way forward is through a combination of those changes. Recall, as shown in this picture, that nearly half of all federal spending goes to Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments on the debt. Few members of Congress have called for cutting spending in those areas. In addition, many members seem to want more spending on defense and border security rather than less. Some have proposed cutting Medicaid, but I hope they and you realize that Medicaid covers almost half of all nursing home bills in this country, and that Medicaid benefits for children not only help those kids now, but also boost their earnings and tax payments when they grow up. Cutting federal spending on infrastructure and research would hinder economic progress. Cutting benefits for lower and middle-income Americans would hurt those who have been struggling the most in the economy. I'm not arguing that spending cannot be cut. I'm simply reminding us that cutting spending efficiently and fairly is difficult. Meanwhile, of course, most people do not want to pay more taxes, and taxes can discourage work, saving, and investment, which also hinders economic progress. So raising taxes efficiently and fairly is difficult too. But I want to point out that federal tax revenue this year is estimated by CBO to be 17.0% of GDP, which happens to be exactly the same percentage as in 1962, the year I was born, and when far fewer Americans were collecting Social Security and Medicare benefits than are doing so today. All told, these considerations show why the only realistic way forward is to both cut spending and increase taxes relative to what would happen under current law. Let me close by thanking you for your commitment and hard work to managing the federal budget in a prudent manner on behalf of all Americans. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for your remarks. Pardon me. I yield myself 5 minutes for our question and answering session. I wish I had all day with you. Mr. Walker, my friend, you've been working on this issue as longer than anyone. And you've got a good, I think, pulse on the mix of things that have to happen. So I put tremendous confidence in your counsel. But this, you are the one that sort of revealed to me that, and shockingly so for me, I mean, just profoundly shocking, that there was a time when our nation, our free and sovereign states, recognized or expressed such great concern about a runaway federal government that there was the requisite number of states, Scott, that applied for a convention of the states to rein us in with some set of controls. Not all of them were fiscal, but the majority of them were. Explain what happened next. So we had the requisite number of states. What's supposed to happen that didn't happen, and what do we need to do to make sure that that grievous error never happens again?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The founders were very smart people. They envisioned that Congress might become so out of touch and so out of control, or that there could be certain issues where there was a fundamental conflict of interest, controlling spending, mounting debt burdens, term limits, campaign finance, that they provided that the states should have an equal opportunity to be able to propose constitutional amendments under Article 5 of the Constitution. Under Article 5, it says that if 2/3 of the states, at present 34, file an application for a convention of states to propose one or more amendments, then the Congress shall, non-discretionary, automatic, no independent judgment, call the convention. I and a few other people have discovered that in 1979, 39 states, well more than the 34, had active applications for a convention of states limited to a fiscal responsibility amendment. Of the 39, 32 were fiscal responsibility only. The other 9 were plenary, meaning any topic. In 1983, it rose to a high of 40, with 32 fiscal responsibility only. As of today, there's still a majority of the states that have fiscal responsibility only. The Congress has been derelict since 1979. It's my understanding nobody here was in Congress in 1979, so you can blame your predecessors, okay? But the fact of the matter is that this is critically important. Congress has not assigned responsibility for anybody to receive, store, and count the applications, not just for fiscal responsibility, but for anything. And I'm here to tell you that several states are now planning to sue the Congress for failure to call a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment. It's not just about fiscal responsibility, which I believe is job one. If we don't put our finances in order, frankly, this other stuff doesn't matter. But other people want term limits. Some people want campaign finance. They want different issues. The Congress has got to do two things. One, establish the process. That's what HCR 24 is about, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for introducing it. And secondly, if we've ever hit 34, which we have, but if we've ever hit 34, call the convention, unless the Congress wants to do something itself. By the way, last thing, the 17th Amendment, which is direct election of senators, and of course there's pros and cons to that, but nonetheless, the 17th Amendment, the states got enough for a convention back then, but it was never called because the Congress acted. The Congress proposed its own amendment. But Congress has done nothing on this other than talk, and that's got to change.
It is a constitutional travesty, and I can't shake it, that we had the requisite number and we failed to act. And now we are so far worse without that intervention. I've got 30 seconds. I want to give it to Ms. Boccia. My colleagues and I have a healthy debate about balanced budgets and fiscal commissions, and some would say that's our job. I mean, ultimately, it's about our will collectively to do these things, whether bipartisan or in reconciliation, unilaterally. We never do it, but it's our job. And no other mechanism, fiscal commission, balanced budget or otherwise, is going to save us from this, from ourselves, so to speak. Give me just a quick, because I'm out of time, but give me a quick response to that. Why would you not just give up on all this and just get back to putting pressure on members of Congress and educating the public to put pressure on Congress? Ms. Boccia.
I think that Congress suffers from a lack of mutual understanding of what is at the source of our country's fiscal problems. And I think that's where we need to start, is to send the same message that we understand that this is a spending-driven debt crisis and that it's the entitlement programs, which, as the Treasury reports annually in the Federal Financial Report of the United States government has shown, Medicare and Social Security are responsible for more than 100% of our long-term unfunded obligations. So continuing to ignore the elephant in the room is not helping. And I do believe that a fiscal commission, as I know you've supported the Fiscal Commission Act, could help Congress get to that shared understanding and then adopt a credible fiscal commitment to demonstrate to financial markets and the American public that we're serious about tackling this problem before a fiscal crisis topples our nation.
Thank you, Ms. Boccia. To my ranking member, 5 minutes or so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dean Elmendorf, following up on that last comment, does Social Security add 1 dime to our national debt?
So, thank you, Congressman Boyle, former Dean Elmendorf, thankfully.
Former dean of my alma mater, the Kennedy School, and former CBO director. So I think you have a great perspective to answer that question.
The government deficit arises from the gap between spending and revenues, and the debt is the accumulation of deficits. And so saying that debt is the fault of either revenues or spending alone isn't right. It's the gap that matters. For Social Security in particular, Social Security has been building up reserves since the early 1980s agreement between President Reagan, Speaker O'Neill, and members of the Congress. It's been building up reserves in order to pay benefits as the baby boom generation moved into retirement. Social Security has accumulated holdings of government debt, trillions of dollars of those holdings. Now, those won't last forever. The trust fund will, in fact, run out under current law at some point in the 2030s. But at the moment, Social Security has been contributing to, on the positive side, the government finances.
In fact, if it weren't for those reserves, actually, the size of the deficit would be larger over the last several decades, correct?
For a number of years, the revenues brought in through Social Security exceeded the benefit payments. It's the debt, I hope you understand, I know you do, I hope others do, is complicated. The Social Security Fund holds government debt that is subject to limit. So the debt limit you vote on actually includes those holdings. But most economists look at the debt that's held outside of the government itself. And that publicly held debt is a smaller number, although still quite large, than the one that I graphed. And so I think you really want to think about the budget in a unified sense. The unified budget was developed decades and decades ago. And I think you want to think about spending and revenues together in that way.
Let me, you, in your brief testimony, made 3 points. Let me address the first one. If you can expand, you said, and I think I'm roughly quoting you here, no, we are not currently in a fiscal crisis. Can you please, before we talk about long-term, can you expand on that point?
A fiscal crisis is when investors are unwilling to hold countries' national securities except at exorbitant interest rates. And as has been pointed out, it's not always easy to predict when those are coming. Economists don't have good rules of thumb, in part because there aren't that many episodes. Countries differ in a lot of different ways. But one leading indicator is certainly what's happening to interest rates. And
Particularly the 10-year.
well, the 10-year rate is an important example of that. Interest rates in this country, although certainly up over the last few years, remain lower than they were for many years in this country. And so even though national debt has grown very considerably in the last 15 years, investors have been willing to hold that debt at rates that are actually low by historical standards.
Now, shifting to the long term, CBO as well as the Social Security trustees have recently revised their timeline. We've actually, because of the strength of this economy and surprising strength of this economy compared to expectations, roughly now 2035 seems to be the date when we would drop below that critical threshold in terms of the Social Security Trust Fund. A couple of years ago, that date was projected to be 2031 or 2032. So we have actually, we should cheer, we have had surprising news on the positive side that we actually have more time. But as the chairman might remember, I have said before, we have good news and bad news. The good news is we have more time to act. The bad news is we have more time to act because I know the way human nature is and I know the way members of Congress tend to respond to deadlines. If we don't act in some way and we get into, say, 2030, 2031, what are some of the options then that would be at our disposal?
Well, a very important advantage if you're acting sooner is to keep more options on the table. And the more you wait until the last minute, be that the last minute that the trust funds have money or the last minute before a fiscal crisis, the more limited your options will be. And the worse the outcome is likely to be for the country. In particular, if you wait, then it's very hard to change benefits because people are already collecting them and they've retired, presuming they will receive certain benefits. I think this was part of why Congressman Ryan, when I worked with him when he was a ranking member and then chair of this committee, worried about trying to change policies early so you could in fact set policy changes in motion that people could then respond to. And this was exactly, in fact, what Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did in the early 1980s, was to make changes in Social Security that stretched out over decades so people could respond to that. If you wait to the last minute, it's very hard to make those changes without throwing people off of their plans.
Well, finally, let me ask you, CBO has recently projected the extension of the Trump TCJA tax cuts would add about 4.6.
The gentleman's time is no.
Would add about $4.6 trillion to our national debt. Is that, well, I know you're no longer the head of CBO. Do you agree with that projection?
I mean, I don't do the numbers on my own. I didn't when I was director, but that sounds to me right. I think that would be digging a much deeper hole unless there were offsetting changes to other provisions of the tax code or to spending programs.
Thank you. I yield back.
Man, I'm a gracious chairman to give you that last question.
Don't dislocate your
Holy
shoulder there.
smokes. Okay, we're now going to give 5 minutes to my friend from California, Tom McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I agree with Mr. Walker that we are perhaps just a few years away from a fiscal crisis, the likes of which this country has never seen and that few countries have ever survived. You know, we keep searching for structural reforms, but we ignore the most obvious answer. It's the word no. You know, we beat our chests about the disastrous deficits, but we keep voting for hundreds of billions of dollars of wasteful grant programs, subsidies that distort the flow of capital, and we keep shoveling money at agencies whose authorizations expired years, sometimes decades ago. Here's the cold, hard truth of the matter. The federal government cannot raise or spend a single dollar unless the House of Representatives says that it can. That is our responsibility. It can't be doged and it can't be dodged. What I find supremely frustrating is that we have right now the ideal tools within our possession to bring our spending in line with our revenues, the budget resolution and the accompanying Reconciliation Act. Now, the Republican majority under Newt Gingrich used reconciliation by the book, and the result was 4 balanced budgets in a row that produced one of the greatest waves of prosperity our nation's ever seen. The Republican majority under Paul Ryan, on the other hand, squandered this authority to chase shiny political objects, repealing Obamacare, then tax reform. And because of the fiscal constraints of reconciliation, Obamacare ended up in this mangled mess that collapsed in the Senate, and the tax cuts had to be made temporary. And we seem to be poised to repeat the same mistakes that got us here, and that would be an immense national tragedy. Instead, we busy ourselves proposing long-term structural reforms. Well, this is akin to an emergency room physician treating a heart attack victim by lecturing him on the virtues of a long-term diet and exercise program. That's only going to matter once you've stopped the heart attack. I believe in a balanced budget amendment. I believe in an amendment giving the president line item veto authority. But I doubt that they can come in time to save our country from insolvency. We can and must do that this year. That means adopting a real budget that sets the lowest spending limits that we can muster and a real reconciliation act to implement those reductions. This budget committee is at the very heart of that process, and it had better rise to the occasion. Ms. Boccia, first, my thanks for your daily newsletters, one of the best that I see every day. Please keep it up. The ranking member noted the catastrophic scourge of COVID on the world. He neglected to mention $3.7 million in NIH grants that funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the most likely origin of COVID. And that was just a fraction of the hundreds of billions of dollars of grants that go out to every NGO under the sun every year that are rarely held accountable, or grants that rob one community to pay for local projects in another. It seems to me this committee ought to be looking at every one of these ludicrous expenditures. What's your view?
Thank you very much for being a loyal reader of the Debt Dispatch. Yes, I think we need to look under the hood of the federal budget and the numerous programs, thousands, in fact, of programs that Congress continues to fund without taking a close look at them. As you mentioned, there are many expired or unauthorized programs that Congress should review, and we may find there's a tremendous amount of duplication, inefficiency, and waste that the federal government could cut. And I thank you for bringing to light particular examples of this, but I also need to highlight that just addressing the discretionary spending and those grant programs is not going to stabilize our spending trajectory or stabilize the debt, since
I
it's
agree.
primarily driven by healthcare costs, interest on the debt,
And
pensions.
particularly entitlement spending. Phil Graham's pointed out that 72% of our unobligated general revenues are going to entitlement spending. Shouldn't we put a strict work requirement back in all of those entitlement programs for able-bodied adults?
So work requirements can work for Medicaid, food stamps, and other means-tested benefits. They are a good idea, and it's something that Congress should absolutely take a look at in reconciliation next year to ensure that the tax cuts are offset.
We need to do it, and we need to do it now. You mentioned all of the structural reforms and the unauthorized spending. Since 1836, the House rules prohibit any appropriation unless authorized by law. And yet we suspend that rule every year, and then we shovel $500 billion at these agencies whose authorizations expired years ago. Shouldn't we enforce that rule, that existing rule, and require an agency-by-agency review of these expired federal programs?
Yes. Congress has suspended too many good rules, such as the pay-go rule, which I fear they may suspend again next year. I hope I'm wrong about this. As also, they have suspended the debt limit, which will return with a vengeance in January of 2025, and Congress should adopt a credible fiscal plan to stabilize our debt before raising the debt limit again, and certainly they should not suspend it, which is basically a borrow as much as you need waiver and no limit.
The gentleman's time's expired, and we now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you so much. This is such an important conversation. It's about money, essentially, and it's about debt, and it's about how we manage our budget. But actually, I think it's a lot more than that. What are the things that are most important that we cover? And I hear you talking about Social Security and Medicare. How do you weigh those things? We know that during the Trump years, there was actually nearly $2 trillion in debt that was occurred when he was the President of the United States. And where did that money in tax cuts go? By and large, to the wealthiest Americans. So I want to talk a little bit about the morality of how we cover our debt and what becomes important. And the very idea that Obamacare, for example, is a bad idea because it's too expensive. And yet we have so many more people who are now covered with health care. I have certainly received, and I think most members have, from constituents who say, thank God, my child was born with a disease that's going to last his life, and now we can afford that. Or people who say, without Obamacare, I probably would not have been alive. And we now have two, I guess they're trillionaires, who are making decisions about the things that we're going to have in how much money we're going to spend. And among the things that I guess have been suggested is that there being a cut in veterans' health care. Veterans' health care. And also Pell Grants, the money to help students to go to college. So I just want to say, this is not just about balancing the budget, about cutting the budget. And I wanted to ask you the question about, yes, doctor, I'm going to call you doctor too, where do these kinds of decisions come in? And what if we were to say, how about there's another way to get more money? And that would be asking the very wealthiest people who can well afford more money to keep this wonderful government going. What would that be as another way to weigh what is important in terms of balancing our budget?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think you're just right to highlight the distributional consequences of these budget decisions. All parts of the government spending and all parts of taxes are not alike in their effects on economic growth or the effects on who bears the burden of these changes. And I think it's very appropriate for you and your colleagues to think hard about those issues. I also agree with you that these government programs that you and others have talked about are a crucial counterweight to a widening of the income distribution that we've seen in this country over the last several decades and to a decline in income mobility that we've seen in this country over the last several decades. And these programs can make a huge difference, both in the immediate lives of people and in their ability and their children's ability to thrive over time. So I think that it would be a very appropriate part of a deficit reduction agreement to raise taxes on higher income people, in my own view. But I do want to echo something that Romina said a few minutes ago about something being good but not sufficient. And if you look at the budget options that CBO presents, it includes options that involve raising taxes on higher income people. And you can raise a good deal of money that way by any normal human standard, but nonetheless, that was much less than you would need in the total to put debt on a sustainable path. So my own values have me agreeing, my own assessment of the economic evidence about the effects of tax increases has me agreeing with you that raising taxes on higher income people would and should be part of a deficit reduction agreement. But I want to caution that other changes will be needed in taxes or spending as well.
Well, in the second I have, let me just say to my Republican colleagues who think Social Security and Medicare should be on the table, I want to say, make my day, because most Americans really oppose that idea. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
You know, I think you see where the difference lies. We just have two different worldviews. I think I heard the word, our wonderful government. I think the states created the federal government, not vice versa. I think the American people spoke loud and clear at this last election. You're not going to spend my tax dollars, this wonderful government, to fund free education for everybody. I think this last election showed that you're not going to open the gates to illegals to flood this country and basically end our sovereignty. We're a nation of borders. I think this election showed that the American people are fed up with regulations, with bureaucracy. It's the businesses that are the backbone. And I don't think my friends on the other aisle understand. You know, most businesses start out very small. Nike in a garage. Elon Musk started very small. Most businesses too that do and end up big. Is that not a good thing? And I don't know that they understand that corporations don't pay tax. The taxpayers pay the tax. So if there's one thing that we're trying to get a handle on, and I think it's a brilliant idea of President Trump on the DOGE Commission. You're taking two individuals who have been very successful, are not getting paid and are donating their time, and are going to examine this thing we call our great federal government. And I think that if they can get the individual cuts that are being suggested when they come out with their report in, I think hopefully earlier, but our birthday on July 4th of 2026, that it's we the people that will put the pressure on the politicians. Crony capitalism is killing this country. People have put those in office, and to be fair on both sides of the aisle, to do the bidding for our tax money. And if there's one thing that I think we all talk about, and everybody says it during campaigning, we're conservative. We want to return conservatism to our nation. But I'm telling you, the clock is running. And I'm sorry I missed a lot of your commentary, but you know, the interest on the debt alone is over $860 billion a year. Anybody that thinks that's sustainable is, I think, either living in a different world or don't understand basic economics. Mr. Walker, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I would. First, let me, if I say, comment on what you said and Ms. Shanaskowski. It's about money. It's about morals. It's about the Constitution. And it's about results. We've got problems on all four of those fronts, and we have to address all of those. By the way, Social Security Medicare, I was a trustee of Social Security Medicare. They used to run positive cash flow. Now they're negative cash flow. And people don't understand that if you do nothing, Social Security benefits will be cut 21% across the board, automatically, by law, and increasing over time. And Medicare, either premiums or benefits, premium increases or benefit reductions will be cut 10 to 15% automatically by law, so doing nothing is not an option. And by the way,
ask rich people to pay more into
Well,
Social Security.
there's no question, there's no question that we have to have more revenues. There's no question that more people need to pay something, because over 40% pay nothing in income tax, 20% get a credit. There's no question the wealthy need to pay more, okay? But it's a matter of what's the weighting, how do you get it done, and I'll just say this at the end. There's no way you're gonna make these tough choices without a commission, a statutory commission. The people are way ahead of the politicians. They know you cannot continue on this path. They're willing to accept tough choices. I got 77 to 97% support for Social Security, Medicare, tax, and other reforms. They're way ahead. But you have to put a mechanism in place to set the table, till the ground, set the table for you to take a tough vote. That's got to happen, all right? And last thing is, you got to have a constitutional amendment, because that's the only thing that will bind current and future Congresses and provide discipline over time. Absolutely essential. Thank you, sir.
And we've got in South Carolina, we have to balance the budget. Congress should be no different. And it's a reprioritization of money spent. And the American people are ready for it now, and they're tired of politicians. The only thing we do well is spend other people's money. It's coming to an end. The last vote in November 5th showed it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Michigan, Mr. Dan Kildee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I make a comment and ask a question, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing, but mostly for your service on this committee. As you both mentioned, I'm leaving the committee, I'm leaving Congress at the end of this term. I promised my wife I would do this for 10 years, and I'm leaving Congress after 12 years, so that's about how I keep most of my promises, just about there. I've been very fortunate to serve on this committee for most of my time in Congress, and this committee has been populated by some really thoughtful members, and particularly the leadership. Mr. Boyle, we've become friends for a long, long time. You are, I will acknowledge, from Pennsylvania, not South Florida. Mr. Arrington, you and I have had a lot of fun together. I'm not going to mention, how the golf match that we had turned out. I won't bring it up. But, we've had great members. Mr. Yarmouth, I've served with, Jason Smith, Steve Womack, Tom Price, Chris Van Hollen, Paul Ryan, have been the leaders of the committee in the time that I've been on this panel, and I'm very much appreciative of the chance to serve with so many of you. Jan, we've served together for a long, long time. Scott and I came in together, a few others. It's a great committee. We do have a big challenge, and I think the real question is whether in the coming years we're going to see that challenge met. This has been a thoughtful conversation, and it does daylight that we do have some big challenges, but we also have some conflicting interests that we're going to have to reconcile. The reality is I think as Mr. Walker pointed out, that an effort to deal with efficiency is critical, but it doesn't, efficiency alone, produce the kind of results that will get us to balance. We also have to look at the dynamic effect of not only tax policy, but of the investments that we make. I've often been frustrated by the fact that when you think about some of the spending, we don't think about it in terms of the return on investment that spending might create. For example, I've been, a huge advocate for focus on early childhood education, making sure that those young kids get the best start they can possibly get. We look at the wrong window. We look at the wrong budget window when we measure the benefit of that investment. If we think we're going to get all of that investment returned to us within a 10-year window, we're measuring the wrong 10 years. So we have to think more thoughtfully, not just about the dynamic effect of tax policy, but the dynamic impact for the future of this country, not just in terms of the quality of our society, but just something as simple as the fiscal responsibility that we have. Simply cutting to get to a balanced budget in a current year might be the thing that unbalances budgets in the out years, and we just have to keep that in mind. And I am particularly concerned that while there seems to be a large focus right now on spending cuts in that small section of the domestic spending, of the discretionary spending that we have, often falls into that category where it's penny wise and pound foolish. And at the same time, a lot of focus, as the 2017 tax bill, many of its provisions are about to expire, that what I hear from a lot of my colleagues is to simply extend some of those and maybe even go further in extending some of those cuts that I think contribute to the inequity within the tax code. So I wonder, Mr. Elmendorf, if you might comment on that specific question, and especially on the effect of an effort to cut spending in some of the areas of domestic spending that might have a positive long-term net return, and simultaneously extending some of the 2017 cuts that continue the process that was set in place that has a firefighter in Bay City, Michigan, pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the wealthiest people in this country, some of whom are actually going to be in a position to make suggestions about how to cut the budget. Could you, in the 39 seconds I have left, make some comment? Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I think your focus on the investment nature of certain kinds of government spending is extremely important. And as you know, the Congressional Budget Office has been doing more work analyzing the effects of investments beyond the 10-year budget window. Reports on infrastructure spending, report on the effect of Medicaid for children. I don't think they've gotten to preschool education, early education yet, but I hope that's on their agenda. I think your point is very well taken. At the same time, we need to recognize that not every investment will pay for itself, and therefore, attention needs to be given to how these investments will be funded. But I think it's very important, as you and your colleagues think about changes in the budget, that you think about what will matter not just today and tomorrow, but in the years and decades to come. Because that's the goal of deficit reduction, of debt reduction, is to build a stronger economy for the long term. And those investments can be very important.
I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the panel, and I know some of my colleagues will appreciate me saying this for the very last time. I yield back.
Well, that's, well, the distinguished gentleman and our friend from Michigan's time has expired, but his legacy hasn't. And your statesmanship will live on in the spirit of how we conduct our business on this committee. Dan, we'll miss you. Now to my friend from the Keystone State, Mr. Lloyd Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The thing about a sovereign debt crisis is we don't know when that will occur. And you said that, Dr. Elmendorf, you believe we have a little more time, but you also believe that we have a limited time. We already saw a softening of the treasuries earlier this year, which was concerning. We weren't sure that individuals would be willing to continue to buy our treasuries. And of course, when that happens, we'll have a sovereign debt crisis. And to your point on the interest rate, yes, they're low, but we have a lot of short-term treasuries out there that are going to need to be refinanced in the next few years, and investors already are demanding more. So they almost certainly, no matter what we do, will continue to rise. We're already at $1 trillion in debt. We get higher, you begin to get into a cycle where it's going to be very, very hard to get out of it when we have an increasing percentage of our revenue or our expenditures just on interest alone. I do want to get back to Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf. I believe you said revenues today are 17% of GDP. That was true in '62 as well. And you're saying today that is with the current rates in place.
Yes.
So there's a lot of thoughtful discussion here on both sides of the aisle. I think we have a math problem. We should think of it as such rather than a political problem. And so we should all be working from the same set of facts. And I really appreciate some of the members on the other side of the aisle who see a problem here as well. I think we could solve it right here in this room. And we should. In fact, I'd much rather we did that on a bipartisan basis than continue to use a budget reconciliation tool, which both parties have used and which we're going to do again if we can't get this resolved otherwise. But I do want to talk, so the 17%, the historic average of revenue is occurring after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates in place. Agree?
Yes.
Okay. So at the same time that we did that, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we saw a massive impact on average households across America. $6,000 increase in revenue, 6 million people lifted out of poverty, and we maintain revenues that are historic high. That's a success story. So just extending these rates would probably continue revenue at current 17%, which I think is a good target. What's spending percent of our total revenue today, Dr. Elmendorf? Our total GDP, I should say.
It's 21% or so?
24.2%.
Oh, because.
24.2%.
That is coming down given the,
It's not coming down.
I was just saying, in the last few years, there's been a bulge in spending, as you know, and some of that is coming off and GDP is growing.
CBO is projecting spending will continue to increase at an average of 4.75% per year, every year for the next 30 years. We're going to be at 500% debt to GDP in 75 years, according to Treasury's report. Spending today is 24.2%. In 1962, do you know what it was as a percentage of GDP?
No, I don't, Congressman.
18.2%. How can anyone say that spending is not the problem? Revenue has held consistent, pretty consistently
But
over
Congressman,
time.
if I may, the issue here is that Congress and the President have put in place programs that provide benefits to older Americans through Social Security and Medicare. And those programs, for any given set of rules, are much more expensive now relative to the size of the economy.
And we have
More
to,
people are over the age of 65.
so we have to
and
recognize
healthcare
that
costs have risen.
we have to
You have to make a choice.
Yeah.
between whether you want to raise taxes to cover the existing benefit commitments, which are more expensive on an aggregate basis because of the growing population, or if you want to cut back on the benefits paid to individuals in order to keep the total down to the previous share.
Completely agree. But ignoring that issue, ignoring that problem, ignoring the demographics will continue us the path towards financial failure of some sort. I think we can solve this on a bipartisan basis. I, of course, talked to Mr. Walker and others about a bipartisan debt commission. I think that would be great. But even if we don't do that, I think we have an opportunity right now, as we're discussing another look at at tax policy. We ought to be putting tax policies in place that generate strong economic growth. That's one of the key ways we get out of this. It's what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did very effectively. And then we've got to look at the spending side of the equation. So I really hope we find some group in Congress that includes members from both parties who are really willing to look at this as a math problem and figure out a way to solve it. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from California, Mr. Scott Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just also want to say a word of thanks to you and the ranking member, because I think this in the past, this committee has been known as a performative committee. We're a place where you get up and yell at each other, and I think both you and both of you have taken this very seriously. I think it's reflected by the kinds of witnesses we have here today who are really offering really thoughtful and really straightforward and in some ways uncomfortable recommendations for us. I want to just thank you. That's a sign of your leadership, and I appreciate you both. Despite a seemingly healthy economy, the deficit's growing. It's now $36 trillion. We're borrowing nearly $2 trillion a year just to pay our expenses. As a result of that, we're going to be paying, interest will be the largest item in our budget very soon, because we're borrowing money to pay our expenses, which no one would do. But we've gotten in the habit of that, and I do think with the witnesses that it's time for us to deal with that. I do want to say about Medicare and Social Security, it's not constructive to say, don't touch it. That's what I hear from people over here. This is a dying patient. This is a patient in the hospital bed, and if we don't touch it, it dies. So we have to do something about it. I'm inclined to agree with Ms. Schakowsky that we should raise revenues. I would say also, it doesn't seem to be something that we've done here. I've been here 12 years now, and it seems like we can't do that by ourselves as Democrats. There's not a consensus on how to do that, and we're gonna have to work across the aisle to get this and the other issues that we've raised hammered out. I'll also just say this is on both parties. We've had conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq that weren't paid for. President Bush made tax cuts that weren't paid for. President Obama extended those tax cuts. We had tax cuts under President Trump. We had a lot of COVID relief programs that were vital but expensive. And on top of our annual borrowing, we've added more than $10 trillion to the debt. Going forward, I have to say I don't like to hear this sort of sanguine idea that extending the tax cuts is somehow cost-free. It's not. It's a $4 trillion thing because current law assumes that they end. And current laws assume that they end and then the rates go back up, and that's how we determine the level of the deficit. So if you extend them out, you're changing current law to add more deficit. I think that's right, isn't that right, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, exactly, Congressman.
The other thing is I hear from my colleagues too that, boy, we got so much more, we get so much revenue even after the tax cuts. But of course, if we had not cut the taxes, we would have had even more revenue. Isn't that true, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And do you have an estimate of the amount of money that was?
I don't know.
Well, I imagine it was in the trillions of dollars. So I just think let's get away from this playland where we think that that the best things in life are free. These tax cuts, which I understand there's going to be a tremendous amount of political pressure on my colleagues to extend, and even to grow, they cost a lot. And so I appreciate the constructive comments of all of you who've all acknowledged that this is not just a spending issue, it's not just an efficiency issue, and I too welcome the chance to talk about efficiency in the federal government. I think we should welcome it. I hope that the system that's set up by the president-elect is a good one, that's effective. But we're gonna need revenues. And I think that should be evident to all of us. I'm a co-sponsor with of the Bipartisan Fiscal Commission Act with my friend Bill Huizenga from Michigan. We got that bill passed out of this committee, and I think it's ready to go. I think that's kind of where we need to go. And each of us, I would just say, each of us needs help to cover ourselves from our own extremes. I mean, I got people who believe on the other side of the aisle that, maybe we could just cut taxes forever and we'll just be just fine and still fight back on China. That's not going to happen. I got people on my side of the aisle who think, you never have to make a spending cut to deal with this. And I know that's not going to happen either, but unless we get together in the same room and are bound by facts, I don't think it's going to happen. And finally, I would just say, I have never before considered a balanced budget amendment. And I have to say that some of your comments have made me think about whether that might be helpful, and to not think about, we sort of get a very abbreviated conversation about that here, we're going to balance the budget right away. I know that's not productive, but I like the idea of what Switzerland did. I think something like that has a lot of flexibility, but discipline makes a lot of sense, and I'd like to consider something like that going forward. But at least I think a commission makes sense. This committee thinks a commission makes sense, and I think a lot of us are willing to get at it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, I certainly associate myself with his remarks on the Fiscal Commission, and I appreciate his leadership on that, and I hope that we can do something tangible, meaningful, statutorily this year. I should say, next Congress. With that, we now ask Glenn Grothman from Wisconsin to give us his Q&A and remarks for 5 minutes.
Sure. We talk about revenue. I sometimes like to call it taxes because the people back home might not know what revenue means. But in any event, in the last, say, 6 years, when we talk about these tax cuts being the problem, what has happened to revenues in real terms in the last, say, 5, 6 years?
In nominal terms, revenue has increased.
Okay. Do you know about, Mr. Walker, you know about how much?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to do, we have to focus on what the right metrics are. Things are going to go up in nominal terms because of inflation.
Well, that's why I ask in real terms.
Right, right. And real is after inflation, so I'm not sure they've gone up after inflation. But the bottom line is this. I think if we focus on as a percentage of GDP, revenues as a percentage of GDP, spending as a percentage of GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP, that's a metric that I think provides a fuller and fairer view of where we are, where we're headed. And the truth is, right now, debt to GDP is too high. It's getting ready to go a lot higher. Secondly, we're taxing at about the same level of GDP as post-World War II average. We're spending well above the post-World War II average, in part because of Medicare and, Medicaid or whatever. And so the bottom line is by definition, revenues are going to go up if the economy grows and if you have inflation. So the real issue is, what is it as a percentage of GDP? And that means the problem is primarily a spending problem, but not solely.
Okay, next comment, I was in one of these meetings the other day, kind of surprised me. Sometimes people say it's apparent people on the other side of the aisle feel we have to raise the tax on the wealthy. Since the last tax cuts, do anyone of you guys know what percent overall of our revenue is coming from the, quote, wealthy?
I don't know, Congressman. The CBO does annual analyses of this, but they tend to lag by a few years. So I don't know the most recent years.
It's
but
gone
I think,
up.
Congressman, the issue here is that the share of income accruing to the wealthy has gone up probably over that period. And so as Dave Walker noted, when the economy grows, then revenue will grow. And also, if more income moves into upper tax brackets, then more revenue will be collected relative to GDP. That's right. That doesn't mean that that's a result of the 2017 Tax Act, nor the gains in jobs that
I
Congressman
think
Zucker
a
mentioned
good
are a
case
result
can
of that.
be made that it is, because as people become more productive, the amount of taxes they pay goes up. Mr. Couchman, when I came to Congress in 2015, Congress spent $1.1 trillion in discretionary spending. Last year, we spent $1.7 trillion, a 54% increase. Do you want, and discretionary spending is largely not the type of spending that's going up because people are older, right? You don't have Medicare in there, you don't have Social Security in there. You want to comment on that 54% increase?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is an awful lot of wasteful spending in the discretionary accounts. Between those two periods you mentioned, the percent of GDP for discretionary spending is about the same. But that's something that at least Congress looks at on a sustained basis every single year. The rest of the budget, the other 74% of spending and the 100% of revenue doesn't get that same kind of detailed treatment and review and ability to change things.
A problem we always have in any government based on elections is politicians are always going to try to buy votes every 2 years. And therefore, I would think the vast majority of governments around the world, if they're in countries based on elections, are going to see the size of their government grow. Ms. Boccia, do you want to comment on what you think are maybe some countries in the Western world in which it pays politicians to increase the spending? Some ways in which other countries have maybe solved this problem or gone away towards solving the problem?
Yeah, and to your previous question, the top 10% of income earners pay about 70% of our income tax burden. So we already tax the wealthy very heavily. In fact, the United States has one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. The countries that I mentioned earlier in my testimony, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and really most of the European countries tax their middle-class taxpayers at much, much higher rates, often in the form of value-added or consumption taxes. And that's really what it would take for the United States to be able to get closer to covering its fiscal gap, is you cannot just raise taxes on the wealthy. There's not enough money at the very top. My colleagues Adam Michel and Brian Riedel at the Manhattan Institute have calculated this numerous times in various forms. So if we're talking about just relying on revenue increases to close our fiscal gap, we need to be honest with the American people that we're talking about significant, steep middle-class tax hikes. And I haven't seen members of Congress on either side of the aisle propose a serious plan that would do that, and it's not a plan that I would recommend. So in terms of what I would recommend is that if you look at those countries, Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden, is that what they have in common is a bipartisan commitment to fiscal sustainability, regardless of our differences on the margins, which programs one party prefers over another, how much we think we should tax the wealthy versus other Americans. We can reconcile all those differences if we're willing to come to the table, and we can agree on that shared goal that we should not be financing our spending on the backs of working Americans in the future and younger Americans who are not even able to
The
vote
gentleman's
yet.
time has expired. We will now move to our friend from California, Mr. Jimmy Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thanks for all your testimony today, gentlemen and lady. I appreciate this because what you got to realize is not many other people on the Hill in Washington, D.C. are talking about this issue. I mean, when it came down and what we saw the last election, there were just sporadic mentions by the major party presidential candidates, let alone a serious plan to address it. And as I say it and I sum it up, debt, literally and figuratively, is a 4-letter word. So thank you for being here. And thanks to the chairman and ranking member for having this type of hearing in which we're actually talking about it. But what we got to realize that the discussion cannot be confined to this room. It has to be done outside of this room, outside of Congress, and yes, throughout the United States of America. But it does start here, so I appreciate that. And as we know, as we go into the 118th Congress, I'm glad that we're taking the time to examine the fiscal situation of our nation, which by all accounts, as we've heard, is getting worse. Now, as you have mentioned, the national debt has reached a staggering $36.1 trillion, and the deficit is now at $257 billion. Simply stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio at 97% of GDP would require a $7.9 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. And reducing the debt to GDP ratio to pre-pandemic levels would require $15 trillion in 10-year savings. These are sums, and it's an issue that is going to affect our future. And one day, bond investors may look at our government and say they won't get paid back. That's what's going to lead to higher interest rates. And that could restrain our economic growth, and it could crowd out our priorities and potentially impair for our ability to borrow, either in war or at another crisis. And beyond the downgrades to the U.S. credit rating and lackluster demand for Treasury debt at some auctions, 2 of 3 major credit ratings, as I said, companies downgraded the U.S. because of our dysfunctional politics. What we got to realize is that one day the U.S. is going to find it very, very difficult to keep borrowing money. And one day the interest costs will constrain us. And guess what? That's when the money we have now to pay for these programs that we've talked about, that I agree with, as a proud Democrat, that's when we're no longer going to have the money to pay for those programs if we don't do anything now. That's why tackling the issue requires both parties to seriously consider trade-offs to address revenues and spending. And make no mistake, both parties share responsibility for this problem. Despite what candidate Trump said in 2016, that it would pay off the national debt in 8 years, the national debt grew under him by $8.18 trillion. It grew by $7 trillion under the Biden administration. And over the 2 terms of the Obama administration, it added $8.3 trillion to the debt, and the Bush administration added $6.1 billion. So each year, the longer we wait to act, the solutions available become more extreme and less palatable. And we know that this is a serious problem. And as each of you have pointed out, these are going to be serious implications for the long-term health of our economy and worse, for the future of our democracy. Now, one of the barriers to action on debt is that so many proposed solutions are just politically unpopular. My Republican colleagues don't want to raise revenues, and many of my colleagues on my side of the aisle are resistant to even examining spending. However, I worry, as we've heard today, that the longer we take, the more extreme steps must be taken to manage the debt. Mr. Elmendorf, what steps would need to be taken to stabilize debt to GDP ratio at a healthy range, even now?
Well, Congressman, thank you for the question. To stabilize debt at about 100% of GDP, where it stands today, we would need to reduce the annual deficits by about $600 billion relative to current law. And as I say, if one wants to extend the expiring tax provisions, one needs to make up for that. Then additionally, if one wanted to bring debt back down as a share of GDP to the areas that we were more familiar with before, then you need to do even more than that. But even $600 billion a year would be a tremendous change, a tremendously large change to make in spending and tax policies.
And quickly, Mr. Walker, I was one of 3 Democrats that voted for the Fiscal Commission on this budget committee when he passed it out of here, which I think is a responsible way to proceed. What would you say in response to those that actually oppose the Fiscal Commission on process grounds?
Well, as is mentioned, some people say, well, that's your job, and therefore you should do it. And the problem is the track record speaks loudly. Things have gotten much, much worse. It's a bipartisan problem. You know, I've done citizen education engagement, including some with your dad, okay, in 47 states, 2 territories, and several countries. The people are way ahead of the politicians. They're focused on debt to GDP, revenue to GDP, spending to GDP. I got 77 to 97% support for specific reforms in all the areas we've talked about and more that would stabilize debt to GDP at a lower level than we are now, which is what we need to do, okay? And so I think my question is it, you know, if not now, when? If not us, who? So I commend you for supporting that. We need that commission desperately. That can help us make much bigger changes than DOGE will ever make, although I support DOGE. But understand this, even if you do that, and you're gonna have to do it to make these tough choices with trade-offs. Secondly, you gotta have a constitutional amendment to be able to maintain discipline over time. The debt ceiling's a bad joke. You know, it totally failed. And statutory approaches like Graham-Rudman or whatever, they don't stand the test of time. Only a constitutional amendment can bind current and future Congresses. Thank you, sir.
Thank you again, witness. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California for his leadership on the Fiscal Commission, and now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Georgia, Mr. Buddy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. I'll jump right into it. I'm not going to repeat all the stump speech parts of this that I have. $36 trillion in debt, adding $1 trillion of debt every 100 days, spending money, $200,000 every second. The speed of light's 186,000 miles per second. Spending money faster than the speed of light. And as we know, the interest on our debt, the second highest line item in our budget now. And we all know it's unsustainable. We all understand that. And we all have heard about the economists who are predicting what's going to happen here. And in fact, Penn Wharton estimate the country's fiscal crisis will become irreversible at some point between 2040 and 2045. So, Mr. Walker, I want to start by asking you your projections of a potential debt crisis with Social Security and Medicare. 70% of our budget. And you know, I'll go ahead and say it. Look, I'm a healthcare professional, I'm a pharmacist by profession, and healthcare is the fastest growing section of our budget because of an aging population. We all understand that, and we've got to get it under control. First of all, we got to have transparency to understand where the problems are. We need that in healthcare, but 70% of our budget, healthcare and Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And if we don't address that, we can do away with everything else and still not balance our budget.
Well, first, the fastest growing expense of the federal budget is interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing. The second fastest growing expense in the federal budget is health care. We've written a blank check for health care. Not even Sweden, which provides health care cradle to grave, writes a blank check for health care. It'll bankrupt the country. Thirdly, Social Security is solvable. All right, and the reason it's solvable is because young people don't think they're going to get it. They're wrong. They're going to get it. All right, seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of. I could use other words, but I won't. All right, so we have an opportunity to reform that program to exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans, and it's not that difficult to do. Healthcare is a bigger challenge. All right, it's a bigger challenge. And by the way, I'm on the Defense Business Board. Defense can't be off the table. There's a huge amount of waste in defense. A huge amount of waste. We need to cut the tail, which is overhead, to sharpen the teeth. And we need to reposition our footprint, force structure, and platforms for the future war, not the past wars. So, look, this is a solvable problem, but realistically, the ground has to be tilled, the table has to be set for members to take a tough vote. And that's why the commission is absolutely essential.
And you would agree it's got to be bipartisan. I mean, it'd be political suicide for one party to try to do it by themselves. I don't care which party it is.
There were 6 principles that the people agreed to with a 92% support. Pro-growth, socially equitable, culturally acceptable, mathematical integrity, bipartisan support, politically feasible, which means you got to be bipartisan, and meaningful bipartisan support. And the reason being is the margins are close. They're close this year, they were close last Congress, they're going to be close the next Congress. You know, if you don't have meaningful bipartisan support, it will not be sustained over time.
You talked about a potential balanced budget amendment, and I agree that needs to happen. Mr. Couchman, if we were to have successful fiscal responsibility amendment, what would be the must-haves?
Oh, that's a great question. The most important thing is a provision that restores the norm of balance. That's most of what you get out of a constitutional provision. You also want to have a supermajority for emergencies so that it doesn't become a loophole. And you want to have a decently long glide path to get to balance. And it's a good idea to be able to choose between primary balance and full balance because it's about double the amount of savings that you would need to reach full balance compared to primary balance. But you also need to have a functional budget process, and that's not something that Congress has right now. And you, sir, have one of the pieces of fixing it, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You mentioned emergencies. Are there any other areas that should be exempt?
No areas should be exempt from the budget, except perhaps net interest, because that is exogenous to what Congress is able to control. Interest rates change based on market dynamics, and the stock of debt that the interest rates are fluctuating against is not something you can do a whole lot about in the near term.
Ms. Boccia, what, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but you've got experience in Europe, and what would something like a debt break work? How would that work here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so debt breaks enjoy popular support because they tackle the debt, which is something that the entire public can get behind regardless of their political affiliation. But if you look at how they actually work, they either are a deficit limit, in the case of Germany, for example, or in the case of Switzerland, they're actually implemented as a spending limit. In Sweden, it's a combination of those things. I think it's a good approach to target multiple layers there, although you also want things to be very clear. But what's important is also what Kurt shared, is that these debt breaks, they don't try to balance next year, which would cause economic calamity because
How do you eat an elephant?
So
one bite at a time.
Right.
Sure.
Over time, they lock in that fiscal commitment credibly with popular support and politicians from all parties standing behind that. And then they give the politicians a process and an oversight function through an independent council to hold lawmakers accountable. So it all works in tandem. But I do need to emphasize that you cannot just adopt a balanced budget amendment and then hope that the budget will take care of itself. Congress still will need to do the tough work of actually identifying how we get on that path to balance, but the balanced budget amendment can act as a commitment device.
Great. Thank all of you for being here.
Thank
you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Georgia. Now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Ballant from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I appreciate you coming here. As we discuss fiscal responsibility, which is a very important topic, I want to dive into some of the details of the Trump tax cuts because I hear about this a lot from my constituents. So the tax cuts enacted under the first Trump administration were skewed to the very wealthy. That's the reality. And this angers a lot of Americans who understand that we do not have tax fairness in this country. And because of that, it's not just that the economy suffers, it's not just that the deficit increases, but the health of the democracy suffers. And American families struggle because of this. And it's estimated by the Center on the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that 2025 households with an income in the top 1% will get on average a tax cut of over $60,000. But if you're in the 0.1%, you'll get a tax cut of over $250,000. Meanwhile, those in the lowest earning bracket will get back about $70, 70 measly bucks. So flashback to 2017, Trump officials claimed that at a minimum, the law would lead to a $4,000 increase in household income. This didn't happen. What did happen was that workers earning under $114,000 a year saw basically no increase in earnings from the tax cut. But the wealthy sure got richer. Now we have a situation where Trump is coming in for a second administration. He wants to go even further this time. He doesn't just want to extend the tax cuts, he wants to further cut the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. And he said that tariffs should replace the income tax, which will, of course, fall on the folks who can least afford to pay for it. Working class families, middle class families, they're going to pay more on higher goods. I don't think that most Americans want a trade war that's going to drive up the cost of groceries and other household goods. They want us to make life more affordable for them, not more expensive. So yeah, I think we should talk about fiscal responsibilities. My colleagues have spent decades pushing deficit-funded tax cuts that benefit the wealthy and corporations. From the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, we've talked about it here, it has increased trillions and trillions of dollars to the debt. Americans do not want cuts to Social Security and Medicare. They don't want cuts to food programs that feed hungry kids. They don't want cuts to Medicaid that helps seniors afford care in nursing homes. What they do want, they want tax fairness. I hear this over and over again. What they do want is for the Pentagon to actually finally pass an audit so that American taxpayers don't keep getting ripped off by companies in the defense industry. What they want is for the wealthy to pay more and for them to feel like there is some fairness here. In 1973, the top 1% took home 9% of the income in the US. Today, the top 1% takes home nearly 27% of the income in the US. Again, from 9% in 1973 to 27% today. This gross economic disparity is terrible for individual Americans. It's terrible for families. It's bad for the democracy. It erodes civil society. They just want fairness. They want us to pass a tax code that helps regular people and closes capital gains loopholes that benefit the very wealthy. Middle-class families already bear too much of the tax burden because of unfair tax codes. I want to paraphrase former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, because I keep coming back to this. We can have a democracy, or we can have most of our country's wealth in the hands of just a few Americans. But we can't have both. They're on a collision course. So Dr. Elmendorf, I support raising the top capital gains and dividend rate back to the rate under President Ronald Reagan. Would this help us to put a dent in our debt?
Yes, Congresswoman, raising those tax rates would raise tax revenue for the government and therefore reduce the deficit and the debt over time. But again, I would repeat a caution from earlier, which is that the amount of the benefit there for the government's budget outlook would be fairly small relative to the overall imbalance that we have all been talking about.
It's certainly not a silver bullet, but it goes to the issue of tax fairness.
I think it goes to the issue of tax fairness. I don't know the specific numbers you've been referring to, but you are correct that income inequality has increased substantially over the last several decades in this country, and that an important counterweight to that is the progressive nature of the tax code. And the 2017 Tax Act gave particularly large benefits to higher income people relative to lower income people, and an extension of that would have that same effect again.
I thank you for being here. I thank you all.
I thank the gentlelady, and now you have 5 minutes to my friend from Kansas, Mr. Estes. Catch you off guard, Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for our witnesses for joining us today. I do want to introduce one comment just before I make my comments. Is, you know, one of the things that we need to make sure that when you're talking about tax rates and tax dollars paid, obviously the higher income folks, if you lower the rate, would pay less in taxes just because they paid more to start with. And at the end of the day, after the Trump tax cuts, they actually, higher income, still paid more taxes as a percentage of income tax that was totally collected. In fact, by the CBO data, according to the CBO data, Republican tax reform reduced federal taxes for every household across every income level, but increased the share of taxes for the top 1%. So I know it's as we talk through numbers, there's percentages and dollar amounts, but we need to make sure that, you know, what the true effect is. And I know as my friend from Georgia, Buddy Carter was talking about, there's a whole host of statistics we could talk about, whether it's the $36 trillion in debt that we're at, or the $75,000 to $100,000 a second, depending on which day you calculate the amount of money that's being borrowed. We've got to focus on several things. And I, instead of talking about that a little bit, I want to talk about something I know that Mr. Walker talked about in his presentation is DOGE and the government of the Department of Government Efficiency and the launch of the DOGE caucus here in Congress. I know it's going to present us with a wide range of options and recommendations. And these ideas are just starting to look at how do we reform our government spending and regulation. Just looking at, since President Biden came into office, there's been an additional federal cost of over $1.37 trillion just on the new regulations that were issued, which was about 45 times the calculated cost of President Trump during his President 45 administration, and also about 5 times more than regulatory costs during the Obama administration. So we've got to focus on that as the impact as well. Mr. Walker, during your years with the Government Accounting Office, how can you give us a sense of just how much and how costly the unchecked executive branch rulemaking can be?
Well, DOGE is first yet to be defined. I think it's going to focus on organization of operations. Regulatory issues clearly should be within its scope because they impose cost and burdens on the private sector that constrain economic growth, among other things. And they also are going to try to end up helping save money. And to do that, they ought to look at things like the high-risk list from GAO. They ought to look at the duplication, overlap, and then redundancy report that comes out every year from GAO. They ought to look at the improper payments report that comes out every year from GAO and the Inspectors General. They clearly ought to look at the regulatory burdens, but they also look at we have too many departments, we have too many regions, we have a number of different things that are based on the 1950s. And let me just close with this. As far as I know, I'm the only federal agency head that has transformed and right-sized a federal agency in the 21st century. We did this at GAO, which is government-wide. We made it 15% smaller, 50 to 100% more productive, 3 times the outcome-based results, second best place to work in the federal government, and 95% positive rating for the toughest client on earth, the U.S. Congress. So hopefully they'll learn from that and take a lot of those principles that are transferable and scalable to the rest of government. But that's only a down payment. We need the commission. We need a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, I would guess that most of the American public, including many of my colleagues, aren't aware that the high volume and high cost of some of these regulations that go on, and we need to address some of that within Congress. I mean, that's a lot of our responsibility now moving forward. You know, earlier this year, I was one of the co-sponsors for the Executive Cost Transparency Act, requiring the Congressional Budget Office to include in baseline a table delineating cost of judicial and executive actions since the publication of the last baseline, and helping make sure that we address any of those costs over $50 billion. Ms. Boccia, could you elaborate on how something increased transparency like the Executive Action Cost Transparency Act would help Congress better control excessive spending and hold administrations?
Yeah, at the Cato Institute, we aggregated the cost of emergency spending over the past 30 years, and we were shocked by what we found. We've spent about $14 trillion over the past 30 years by designating spending as for emergencies, and there is no government report that we were able to find that details those figures. And so emergency spending goes on outside of the budget process for the most part and is not subject to spending caps or rules like PAYGO. And that's where the lack of transparency and accountability starts. And so we need the Congressional Budget Office or the Government Accountability Office, or better yet, both, to actually aggregate, detail, and report to Congress on a regular basis the cost of emergencies, those that Congress has authorized, and also, importantly, those that the executive has declared, because that's also where there's a lack of transparency, and the Biden administration has refused to cooperate with Congress to report on executive emergency spending, so we don't even know how much they've been doing in that respect.
Yeah, well, thank you. And unfortunately, I'm out of time. There's so much we could talk about in terms of the out-of-control government spending and excessive rulemaking. And the pathway out of our fiscal crisis is a long one, but we've always got to address that both from the legislative side and the rulemaking side in order to help make sure that we have Americans, families, and businesses and farms that all thrive and continue to grow to keep America strong. So
Thank you for your leadership.
I thank the gentleman from Kansas and yield 5 minutes to our friend from Virginia, Mr. Bobby Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elmendorf, we've heard a lot about both sides, this and both sides the other. You know, and you've pointed out that balancing revenues and spending. If you want something, you have to pay for it. If you're not willing to pay for it, you don't get it. I mean, it's fairly straightforward, and if you're willing to pay for something, you can be in balance if you just pay for it. The last time we saw both one side missing was in the Clinton budget. Are you familiar with the Clinton budget in 1993?
A little bit, Congressman, yes.
Okay, well, one side passed the budget without a single Republican vote. We passed the Clinton budget, and as a result, what happened to deficits after the Clinton budget passed?
So you're right, Congressman, that the Reconciliation Act in 1993 was passed on strict party line vote. But as you know, subsequent to that, there was a set of discussions, arguments, and ultimately compromises between President Clinton and the Congress. By the end of the Clinton administration, the budget was in surplus, which was at the time a rare thing and obviously has not been repeated since that period.
Well, wait a minute, you said there were compromises. Gingrich tried to dismantle the budget when he came in 1995, and Clinton did not budge. He let the government get shut down rather than capitulate and ruin his budget. And basically, the Clinton budget from 1993 stayed pretty much intact for the Clinton administration. And what was projected to happen in 2008 if the budget kept going the way it was going?
So before the Reconciliation Act of 1993, there was a projected sharp and increasingly steep increase in debt relative to GDP. And by the end of the Clinton administration, as you noted, debt not only stabilized relative to GDP, but in fact the government was running surpluses. My reference to
enough to pay off the national debt held by the public by 2008?
Well, there were some very optimistic projections at that point, and I bear some responsibility for those, I think. But that did not come to pass. As you know, there were large tax cuts.
Well, yeah, but we haven't gotten to that. That's the next question.
Yes,
but when Clinton left office, the projections were that we're going to pay off the national debt held by the public by 2008, and by 2013, put all the money back we've talked about in the trust funds. But as you have alluded, something happened in 2001. A new administration came in, followed by the Trump administration, George W. Bush, 2 tax cuts, 2 wars, prescriptive drug benefit not paid for, the Trump tax scam where 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. After those tax cuts, which we were told would pay for themselves, did they pay for themselves?
No, Congressman.
Okay, that was ridiculous. Where did we end up after that? Instead of paying off the national debt, where did we end up?
The debt has increased and is increasing at a very rapid rate over the past 25 years.
So one side passed a budget that was on the way to paying off the national debt. The other side came in and messed it all up. And the next conversation is what to do now. And I think we've said 4.6 trillion is the cost of extending the expiring Trump tax cuts. If we kind of reverse the old adage and don't just do something, stand there, if we don't do anything and let those expire, what would happen to the budget outlook?
Well, as you know, the CBO's baseline presumes that those tax cuts will expire as scheduled under current law. Debt still rises relative to GDP, but not nearly as rapidly as if those tax cuts are extended without any pay-fors.
So that would just make things worse if we let that expire. And we're also talking about cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. If we didn't spend $4.6 trillion extending tax cuts, why would we be talking, we wouldn't need to talk about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, would we?
Well, over time, Congressman, those programs will continue to grow in spending relative to the size of the economy unless you take some action because of the aging of the population and rising healthcare spending. But not extending the expiring tax cuts would give the government more running room, more time, more fiscal space.
My time is about to expire. I think Mr. Walker mentioned DOGE, the efficiency group, which has efficiency committee that starts off with 2 chairmen, which is an interesting way to talk about efficiency. But the optimistic view would be hundreds of billions in savings, and we're talking about $4.6 trillion in extending tax cuts. Obviously, even at the most optimistic, that's not going to come close to paying for those tax cuts. And we've heard a lot about constitutional amendments as a cure. I think we have to look at the possibility that a constitutional amendment could actually make things worse. One version just simply said that if you pass a budget that's balanced, you need a simple majority, but if it's not in balance, you need a 2/3 majority, which would include a deficit reduction plan. And so if you need a meaningful, painful deficit reduction plan under that constitutional amendment, you need a 2/3 vote. Well, the same thing is that you need for a unbalanced budget without any limitation.
I think the gentleman,
And I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, just finally one more sentence, that to get those last few votes, it'd be more expensive and less likely that you'd have a fiscally responsible budget than not. And so I think we have to be very careful when you talk about these schemes that might rescue us.
I think the gentleman,
thank you,
I
Mr.
thank the
Chairman.
gentleman from Virginia, and now I'm going to give at least 6.5 minutes to the other gentleman from Virginia. Look, we were doing about 6 minutes a clip. This is a great conversation, thoughtful on both sides, and I don't know of a conversation more important that happens so infrequently in Washington, D.C. So thanks for the indulgence on both sides. I appreciate the comments. Mr. Bob Good, my friend from Virginia, 5 magic minutes.
Magic. My first magic 5 minutes. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today, and I appreciate the extra time. I want to respond to what the friends on the other side of the aisle have talked about, the tax cuts, and the fact is the TCJA reduced federal tax rates for all households across every income level while increasing the share of taxes paid by the top 1%. It doubled the standard deduction, as everybody knows. Who does that help? Middle America, regular income Americans. It increased the child tax credits. The fact is tax revenue went up to an unprecedented nearly $5 trillion annually because of those tax cuts. And the rising tide lifted all boats. All Americans know they were worse off under the Biden economy than they were in the Trump economy, unless you're an illegal alien. And that's why they voted overwhelmingly to bring President Trump back into the White House. More than 6 million people were lifted out of poverty during the Trump administration, dropping the poverty rate to a record low 10.5%. The income and wealth inequality fell after the TCJA, as real wages for the bottom 10% grew nearly twice as fast as the top 10%, and real wealth of the bottom 50% of households rose 3 times faster than the top 1%. Real wages grew by 4.9%, the fastest 2-year growth in real wages in 20 years. And it was it was diverse. Income for blacks and Hispanics and Asian Americans increased to historic highs, and unemployment fell to historic lows. But the Democrats don't like that because they want to punish success. They want tax welfare. They want to give money to those who don't pay any taxes, and they want punitive taxes on those who are successful and those who drive our economy and help to drive down unemployment and to increase real wages and increase jobs for everybody. But we're here to talk about the debt. And Ms. Boccia, I appreciate you being here. I read your debt digest. I read it this morning, talking about your testimony today. Some of us are listening. And as you know, every dollar we vote on here in Congress, every dollar we vote on is borrowed. Every dollar that we borrow and spend results in either higher taxes, more inflation, as we've suffered under the last 4 years, and or a greater debt burden to our kids and our grandkids. But we are suffering under a $200 billion monthly deficit, as you know, maintained by Republicans over the last 2 years. No impact on that by Republicans, by the way. So I'm an equal opportunity offender to my friend from Virginia across the aisle there. Republicans have grown the debt by some $5 trillion on our watch, with help from the Democrat Senate and the Democrat White House, of course. As you know, the Social Security Fairness Act passed the House a month ago with 136 Republican votes, some of whom are on this committee. Despite its $200 billion cost to taxpayers over the next decade and the acceleration of the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund. The alternative bill, sponsored by my friend, our chairman, which I'm a co-sponsor, the Equal Treatment of Public Service Act, would have more fairly adjusted the benefits formula for Social Security to compensate government employees for the time they actually worked in the private sector and did pay taxes in the Social Security system. But that bill failed, as you know, because too many members of Congress didn't want a more fiscally responsible option. What does this say about Republicans in the House's willingness to address entitlement reform, our debt and our deficit, and our long-term fiscal viability? What does it say when we pass a bill like that?
Thank you. It sends a very bad signal that Congress has not fully yet grasped the severity of the debt crisis that we're in and the threat that a fiscal crisis poses for our nation. It also shows that Congress is still, unfortunately, in the pockets of special interests, as the Social Security, I like to say, Unfairness Act would benefit state and local government unions and their members, which make up a very small special interest group, but they're extremely powerful because they can gain those concentrated interests and diffuse the costs among the general public. What also I found very surprising is that this bill, the Social Security Unfairness Act, would pull forward the Social Security Trust Fund insolvency date by about 6 months. So while we're hearing Congress saying that they won't cut Social Security benefits, in effect, by voting for the Social Security Unfairness Act, they've actually accelerated the trust fund insolvency.
Well said.
If I may, sir?
With 36 trillion in debt, unprecedented debt to GDP ratio we haven't seen since World War II, as you know, the days of spending without consequence are long over, as we've seen with the 40-year high inflation, the 20-year high interest rates, and you mentioned in your testimony the downgrading of our credit by these 3 different agencies. And yet Republican leadership is considering, if not planning, to pass a $115 billion disaster supplemental, so-called disaster supplemental, to borrow and spend $115 billion. Now, setting aside the lack of constitutional justification for the federal government to be in the disaster business, or the insurance business, if you will, and that we're forcing regular middle-income Americans to subsidize coastal elites living in these high-cost areas over and over, by the way, setting that aside, why would we give the Biden administration one more dollar in the final couple of weeks of their administration, let alone FEMA, who's been demonstrated to be politicized and weaponized based on political affiliation, apparently? They admitted they were caught doing that, as you know. Why would we borrow and do that when we don't have the money? Is there any less efficient way to try to help people than through the federal government? I'll let you
Yeah, we have a real moral hazard problem, as you alluded to, with our federal disaster assistance. We need significant reforms there so that the American taxpayer is not on the hook for damages that primarily benefit wealthy Americans. And so if Congress wants to pass a disaster assistance bill, they should pay for it now or later, instead of just adding it to our deficit and debt, which is already unaffordable as it is.
Paying for supplementals, there's a concept. Thank you very much. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from Virginia and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Espaillat from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I always like to come to these budget hearings and meetings because we hear these catchy slogans like keeping Americans strong and out of control spending, and how the last elections were a dramatic landslide, although the victory is only by 2 million votes as opposed to 2020 when Biden won by 7 million votes. But of course, that election was stolen, right? And so we like to hear about this, these slogans, but Dr. Elmendorf, I want to talk to you about how these proposed cuts to vital programs in my district impact not just families, but the economy as well. Let's take, for example, Head Start, one of the surviving programs from the 60s. And it says it very clearly, Head Start. That means that a little kid that goes through a Head Start program has an added advantage, a Head Start, when they get to the first or second grade in a regular public school. And the data is there to show that they do far better academically, and many of them get from Head Start to Harvard. But in addition to this great program, a Head Start program also gives a mom the ability to go to work and has an impact on the economy, and she will pay taxes. So I want to see, Dr. Elmendorf, what are the connections between these proposed cuts to programs like the Head Start program, and not just the families that it will impact on a daily basis, in a real way, but on the economy. There has to be an impact there. Anybody that ignores that is foolish to think that if you don't give a little kid an added Head Start, that kid may get from Head Start to Harvard. And what impact could it have on the economy? Could you share that with us?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you're right to point out that behind these numbers that we'll talk about in gatherings like this, there are people, real people, who are receiving benefits or paying taxes, or both in many cases, and that the government support can matter a huge amount to what they and their families experience. Head Start is one of the number of government programs where economic evidence developed over the last decade of research has shown a long-term benefit of the short-term investments, so that not only is spending today benefiting people today, it is helping them and their children to thrive more in the future. And I think that's one of the aspects of policy that you and your colleagues should keep in mind as you decide where to raise taxes and cut spending to put the deficit on a better path.
I mean, clearly there has been an erosion of the U.S. revenue base because I believe of failed tax policy that has eliminated, and by giving the very rich in corporate America tax break, our revenues. And as a result, you say the deficit is connected to out of control spending. I think the deficit is connected by corporate welfare, and the fact that we're not getting the revenues that we should be getting to give a little boy, a little girl, the opportunity to go to Head Start, and a mom the opportunity to be productive and to go to work. I want to go now and to close, because I know I only have a minute, about going and talk about immigration, because I know that immigration was also like a big issue during this past election cycle. And 18.6% of the U.S. labor force are often employing key industries, agriculture, healthcare. They take care of our sick, they take care of our little kids, they take care of our frail seniors, our immigrants. They mow our lawns, they're everywhere. I bet some members here of the U.S. Congress must be connected to the employment of some of them at some point or the other. What do you see in terms of the workforce and supplementing our workforce if these massive deportations, so-called massive deportations, occurred?
Well, Congressman, if deportations at anything like the scale that the president-elect has mentioned were to take place, that would be hugely disruptive to the economy. As you know, there are certain sectors of the economy where a very large share of the workers.
How would it impact the agricultural industry?
That's exactly one of the sectors where a very large share of workers apparently are in the country without and working without.
Do you think that it will
authorization.
impact our ability to get fruits and vegetables on our table?
Again, if deportations occurred on anything like the scale that's been discussed, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Texas, Mr. Chip Roy.
Thank the chairman, and I thank the chairman for hosting this important hearing as we close out this year and look ahead to next year in reconciliation. I appreciate the witnesses and I appreciate your time. Ms. Boccia, just a real quick question and follow up to the previous line of questioning. Do you think the IRA was in essence, in effect, corporate welfare?
Yes.
Subsidies in significant numbers and amounts to large corporate interests?
Yes, Congress should repeal it.
Agreed. Thank you for your straight and blunt answer. I would ask down the line, irrespective of sort of party invitation. There is debate here about the impact of extension of TICJA. In other words, also retrospectively looking at the impact of TICJA in the first place. Obviously, the corporate part having now, is permanent. So now we've got TICJA non-permanent, and what's the impact? I firmly believe that tax policy has kind of two pieces to it. One is what money should morally be left in the pockets of the people in the first instance, and what does that mean for economic growth and so forth. And then on the second part is what do we have to do correspondingly with the revenue projections to not run deficits? And I think those two things have to go hand in hand. So my question for the panel, quickly, if you might, in a yes or no or close to yes or no format, is some on my side of the aisle would suggest that TICJA will pay for themselves, by themselves, irrespective of regulatory actions, other actions taken, and other forces at play. Is it your position and belief that TICJA, if just extended, will in fact pay for themselves? Yes or no?
As a percentage of GDP, no.
No.
No. No.
Okay. Do you, and so generally speaking, if that's the case, if we're gonna extend TICJA, do we need to include additional measures that would either generate more revenue, maybe on the regulatory side, again, irrespective of one's views of the right regulations to adjust, on the regulatory side to produce economic growth for additional tax revenue based on that economic growth, or on the on the spending cut side? Would you agree that we would need either additional economic juice actions or spending cuts if we're going to minimize or reduce deficits? Yes or no?
Yes, and I think the metric has to be percentage of GDP, not nominal dollars.
Yes, we need both.
The tax provisions are pro-growth. We also need savings. They don't have to be in the same package necessarily.
Okay, but the question was, in order to achieve reduction in deficits, do we need to have corresponding, along with TICJA, will we need either additional economic juice in the form of regulatory action or otherwise, or and along with that, spending cuts? Is that not mathematically true that we need that for deficits to reduce?
Yes, Congressman.
To a large degree, but to the extent that you get economic growth, then you can sustain the debt burden without necessarily fully offsetting everything.
Right, but that's a different question, is it not?
It is.
Right, in other words, I would agree that if we say we're gonna leave deficits exactly the same in perpetuity and grow the economy, that then we can manage that debt burden and that deficit as a percentage. But if deficits are gonna continue to grow, and or even if they stay flat, deficits aren't going to go down. We are not going to reduce deficits without significant spending cuts and or some other significant levers for economic juice to get to the heyday of the 80s of a 4 or 5 or 6 or 7% economic growth in order to grow out of it, in order to get deficits into a manageable position. Do we have general agreement on that across the panel?
Yes, but you need huge institutional upgrades to get there.
Okay. And one last point. You know, a lot of my colleagues will talk about how mandatory spending is the primary driver of our deficits. 70% roughly of the overall spending right now is roughly mandatory spending. Leaving, however, of course, 30% being discretionary spending. Am I not correct that both, given that that's a large chunk and piece of the pie, need to be managed, both discretionary and mandatory?
Yes.
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 Congressman, you need to manage at least one of those two pieces. You and your colleagues could choose to focus only on mandatory programs. That's not what I would recommend to you, but that is
Last
mathematically not.
question in my magic 5 minutes, I'll just go over just a few seconds, is in your all's experience, have you seen in recent memory any proposal on either side of the aisle or jointly to seriously address what we, I think, incorrectly call mandatory spending as opposed to, I call it automatic spending? But have you seen any serious proposals put forward with weight to address by spending cuts, by age changes, or anything else on a collective? Have you seen a press conference in the front of the Capitol with locking arms or any one side come forward to say that they have serious mandatory spending proposal changes?
No, but I've seen two process proposals that'll get us there. The Fiscal Commission Act, which you voted for, HCR 24, which the chairman introduced, and you ought to have I would respectfully suggest have a hearing in your subcommittee of Judiciary and on the Constitution. But individual reform proposals, no. The process matters.
Understood, but in terms of, I mean, we're a legislative body and we have a free will and we can introduce legislation and we can get behind it with press conferences and action. Ms. Boccia, have you seen anything like that in recent memory?
No.
No.
Absolutely, depending on your views on it, the RSC budget proposal.
To a degree, and of course, then there's a massive amount of hammering for it, but has it been put forward to be advanced as the budget or the actual action by any serious weight of Republicans or Democrats?
No, sir.
Right. Sir?
Congressman, I'm not aware of anything that's come to a vote on the House floor that would substantially roll back benefits, except for the repeated votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which would have rolled back those benefits. Also would, if you repealed the whole thing in some sense, would have raised spending on Medicare and changed taxes and so on. But apart from the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, I'm not aware of any legislation.
I appreciate the honest answers in what I hope was trying to be presented in a bipartisan or nonpartisan questioning. I yield back.
I appreciate the line of questioning, and now yield 5 minutes to our colleague from Texas, Mr. Lloyd Doggett.
Well, thank you very much. As perhaps a unique pay-as-you-go progressive, I do not favor major expansions of government programs, many of which I support, without paying for them. And likewise, I think that changes in revenue often have similar impact, and they also have to be offset. And as I understand the answers you just gave my colleague, Mr. Roy, each of you believe that the huge tax continuation, renewal, reauthorization, extension, whatever you call it, that those need to be offset so that we do not just borrow more money from China or the Saudis or whoever will lend it to us to pay for any extension of the Trump tax cuts. Is that, did I hear correctly?
Yes, Congressman, that if
We
one...
offset those.
A general rule of advice I learned from Marty Feldstein when I was in graduate school was that when you're in a hole, you should stop digging.
Right, right.
Generally speaking, more savings of a good variety, and that's in your
Right.
discretion, would be good to do.
Right. And you feel that way too?
We will need to pay for extensions, especially of the individual tax cuts. The pro-growth side is a different matter, but if we extend the whole package, we should pay for it and then some, because we also should take this opportunity to reduce deficits and stabilize the debt.
Thank you. Mr. Walker?
Yes, and focus on the metric GDP. What's revenue to GDP, spending to GDP, and debt to GDP?
Exactly, a very important measure. And actually, though there's been significant criticism in this committee of CBO and suggestions that it should be changed, they came out pretty close in their estimates on the Trump tax cuts of 2017, so that we are now in a situation, I believe, in 2023 of about 17% as the percentage to GDP. I think that was their estimate, and we were at 16.5%, I think is the output versus GDP. I think it is important that that we focus on the recent writing of the chairman. He has indicated on previous occasions that we could not address the budget problems we face by spending cuts alone. And he has written a document called Fiscal Responsibility Begins by Ending Beltway Budgeting Gimmicks. And some of you have referenced those issues in your writings also, but it's really important that we not pretend we are resolving this problem by using gimmicks. One of the gimmicks that I think was used in this committee with our budgets last year, that has been used by Democrats as well, was the so-called reserve fund for pro-growth tax policies. These reserve funds for unlimited tax cuts really simply mean borrowing more from abroad to pay for our debts. And of course, the biggest budget gimmick of all that has been discussed of late and embraced by some of my Republican colleagues is that we simply wave a magic wand over the Trump tax scam 2.0 and declare it to be free because we have adjusted the baseline, the current policy baseline. And I believe, Ms. Boccia, that you have written regarding that specific budget trick, and the writing I saw, the quote was, "Not recognizing the cost of the TCJA extension is a gimmicky attempt to disappear them, but trying to hide them doesn't make them any less real or damaging to the fiscal situation." Is that correct?
This is correct.
Thank you. And Maya McGinnis at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget has also written that if every policy could be enacted temporarily and then assumed permanent, it would create tremendous hidden cost. And that's the gimmick that has been used that leads us to the current situation, hiding the true cost of these revenue changes, these giant tax reductions, and hiding them under temporary when we know that rarely is a tax reduction in Washington a tax cut temporary. It's just a matter of extending it from year to year. So I think it's really important that we avoid tax break deceit in the coming months. We know we're in a hurry up and rush with reconciliation proposals that are pending perhaps as early as next month. It's really important that we not do further harm, that we embrace the kind of commitment that the chair has said is a moral imperative by not adding to the debt either through our spending decisions or through our tax decisions. And I thank each of you for your testimony today.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and now you have 5 minutes to Mr. Moore from Utah.
Thank you, Chairman. This is the topic. This is what we need to be focused on. So I always appreciate your willingness to shine a light on it. I want to just start off, as I've been able to hear and listen, I always come to these hearings ready to hear about the Clinton era. I love the fact that we had a balanced budget then too, and a surplus. I want my colleagues across the aisle to also remember that Larry Summers, the economic advisor to President Clinton, was one that honestly rang out and communicated. We hear all this talk about what's going to be done in reconciliation, right? Whenever anybody has the White House, House, and Senate, a reconciliation bill gets done. Democrats in 2021 did the American Rescue Plan, a $2 trillion bill with no offsets whatsoever. I do not want to be lectured on a bill. If you look at the two of them, okay, none of them paid the debt down, right? But we have to have economic growth. If we do not have economic growth, we do not have the strong GDP that we can try to eventually save the day. I do not want to be lectured when I saw a $2 trillion bill come with no offset spending. Okay? And what I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to pivot now and get in a better mood, because we have something that hasn't been addressed that was brought to our office from Americans for Prosperity to be able to deal with the fundamental issue of why we're here. Is for 50 years, we have not voted, well, if we ever have, voted on the entirety of the budget. We only vote on 25%. So I agree with my colleague, Mr. Roy, when he says all of it's the problem. right? We only get to vote on the discretionary budget and the emergency pieces. We do better than other times, but for 50 years, we've kept the discretionary budget at a rate of growth from 1 to 4.5%. Mr. Couchman, what would you estimate the rate of direct spending, automatic spending, mandatory spending, whatever? What would you estimate the rate of growth for that? Would you rate it below or above 3%?
Well, it's well above GDP growth, so by definition, it's unsustainable.
It's unsustainable. The Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act, which I introduced this Congress, and with the help of everybody at this panel, you are shining the light on this. There's nobody more emotional about this than Mr. Walker, with real data and real highlighting the issues. Your debt digest, Mr. Boccia, it's the one thing. I get a lot of spam in my email. My inbox gets bloated. It gets really, really bloated right now. Yours is the one that I read. The ability for your team to come to ours, Mr. Couchman, and be heavily involved in coming up with a solution. This bill will force us to vote on the entirety of the budget. I do not understand what's wrong with that. I will take a Social Security vote. I will take a Medicare vote. I will vote on Medicaid. I will vote on everything. I don't want to just keep voting on $1.5 trillion of a $7 trillion deficit. If we can't fix this, no matter what type of deficit reductions we can do in reconciliation, if we can't fix the fact that we don't vote on the entirety of the budget, like every state in the entire nation does, then we won't fix this. Would you please comment on the nature of this bill and what it would ultimately accomplish?
Yeah, I would characterize it as giving every committee the opportunity to manage their programs, their portfolio, in the same way that the appropriators do every single year. The Ways and Means Committee has jurisdiction over 100% of revenue policies, taxes, like bases, rates, and expenditures, as well as a number of direct spending programs. Judiciary has some resources. All the committees have a piece of the actual budget, but only one of them has the opportunity to manage that every year. And if you were to do that, you might find that there'd be incredible bipartisan opportunities to drive better value for the American people.
And which committee is it that gets to do it every year?
It's the Appropriations Committee, yep.
How many committees do we have here?
There are 17 with spending authority.
And how many of them are involved in some spending, some budget-related matter at all?
I mean,
pretty much all of them.
Ad hoc from time to time, but not consistently every year with an expected process where you can build coalitions.
Point is, that one committee, Appropriations, over 50 years has been able to keep their budget growth to the rate of inflation, which is the goal for what everybody want to do, in the 1 to 4% range. I'd rather keep it to 1%, but it'll bubble up here or there. You know, COVID years, it put it up a little bit more. But even with COVID years, the appropriations process was able to keep it at a percent. I'm on Ways and Means Committee. I wish I could vote on Medicare, Social Security, the portions that we have a jurisdiction over, Medicaid, all the welfare programs. I want to vote on them every year. I will support them.
Yeah.
I absolutely will support them, but we can't make changes to it. So when 2008 hits and the baby boomers start to retire, all of a sudden everything flipped. The people that were contributing to the program are out taking their benefit that they deserve, but we didn't have a chance to vote on any of this. And this is what the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act will do. I am going to continue to be the strongest of support and fighter for this type of change to happen to our process, because if it doesn't happen, nothing will change with our automatic spending. And with that, Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I yield back a lot more time than anybody else in the last 5 or 7 minutes.
You are passionate about stewarding taxpayer dollars, and you have demonstrated stewardship of your time. Thank you, Mr. Moore, for your leadership. And we will now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Josh Burkeen from Oklahoma.
Man, I don't know what to say to that. Wow. I appreciate the chairman from Southern Oklahoma for holding this very important committee. And Mr. Walker, as I expressed to you, I've been reading about you for decades. Not as familiar as I need to be with your meaningful work as head of the GAO. So I'm going to take the opportunity I have to highlight you. And I want to do that because we have, I think, really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here. As I've been following this thing for 20 years and the spending increase, there is the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with what just happened in an election, and two gentlemen that are holding the banner for efficiency. From the free market, the Doge Commission with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And my great hope is they don't miss the timelines that Congress is going to present in the reconciliation process, because I think that it's something I'm trying to impress upon them, and I hope all of our colleagues are. I hope that we're not setting them up for failure, that they have to know there's 53 senators, and if we're going to get real spending restraint in tandem with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, reconciliation, the fancy way of saying it only takes 50 votes in the Senate, not 60, is an opportunity that may not come around with the enthusiasm that's there that they can popularize. So I want to highlight you would you go back over your resume of what you did when it wasn't nearly this popular decades ago to start restraining the growth of spending? Can you highlight what you had shared with Ron Estes, what your work at GAO? And give everyone kind of an education on what GAO does.
Well, GAO is in the legislative branch, as you know. It's the largest legislative branch agency. It's in the performance and accountability business. It's to improve the performance and assure the accountability of government for the benefit of the American people. It helps the Congress oversee the executive branch. It does financial audits, performance audits, program evaluations, policy analyses, legal research and adjudications, and a variety of other things. It is nonpartisan, staunchly nonpartisan, non-ideological, fair and balanced. It calls it like he sees it. It's focused overwhelmingly on the organization and operations of government. It's in the oversight, insight, and foresight business. And when I was there, I came in, it had been in business since 1921. I came in 1998. No strategic plan. By the way, the U.S. government still doesn't have one. And it's been in business since 1789. We put together a strategic plan. We totally transformed the agency. I eliminated a third of the offices. I eliminated a layer of management, consolidated 35 units into 13, leveraged technology, leveraged a variety of other things, changed our performance metrics, measurement reward systems, our communications with Congress. We were 15% smaller, or a third less footprint, 50 to 100% more productive, 3 times the outcome-based results. We generated $110 for every dollar invested in the agency. Nobody in the government's anywhere close to that. And yet we were the second best place to work in the federal government, 95% positive rating for the Congress. What we did there is transferable and scalable to the executive branch, all right? And I hope that the Doge will end up learning some of those lessons, as long as the other good work that GAO does, like the high-risk list, duplication, overlap, redundancy, along with the IGs, the improper payments, they can save several $100 billion a year if they go it the right way. I'm concerned about one thing. They got to define their scope, and so far they don't have anybody that's associated with them that really has absolutely transformed anything in government. And there's a huge difference between the private sector and the government. There's a lot of transferable skills, but there's a huge difference.
I wanted to highlight you for a reason. I think it's important that your context and your experience be tapped. I'll be encouraging that where I have opportunity. You have a chance to travel now and go into states and excite people about government efficiency. How many states have you been in?
Well, I've done citizen education engagement in 47 states plus DC. I've only got 3 I hadn't done it in, but I've been to the states, I just hadn't done that.
And what are you hearing from the public? Because I think this is important.
The public's way ahead of the politics. They know you can't spend more money than you make, charge with a credit card without a day of reckoning. I got 77 to 97% support for tax reforms, Social Security reforms, Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare, defense, government organization operations, and political reform. 77 to 97%.
And the ability for our discretionary budget to be able to do what GAO does. Most people don't realize GAO makes recommendations of where all other agencies can reform their spending practices. Right. One of the things that I think you were instrumental in doing is making sure the GAO zeroes in on duplication of government. My 15 seconds, I'm over. Can you land the plane and talk about why we're not doing what GAO has been recommending for years, on duplication?
You know, all GAO can do is make recommendations, but Congress or the president or both have to act on it, and that's the problem. It's the difference between strategy and implementation. Implementation is 85+% of success or failure, and that's where the problem is.
I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. Before I introduce our colleague from North Carolina, I'd like to say, as the budget chairman, we're making progress on fiscal reforms. The Fiscal Responsibility Act was the first of its in a decade to hold spending, if not reduce it. We passed a budget, balanced budget, twice out of this committee. And we've got a bipartisan sort of will on the fiscal commission, and I think we might just be able to execute on that in the next Congress. So we're making some progress. We ought to budget for emergencies. That's one flaw of many in our lack of acting responsibly with the stewardship of tax dollars. And when we don't budget for emergencies, we ought to offset them, and they ought to be emergencies, not recurring operating expenses for housing or defense or whatever else. But we're not going to get there overnight and in time to save the lives, literally, of our friends who, by no fault of their own, their lives have been utterly destroyed by a natural disaster. They pay taxes, and until we can reform FEMA, and we ought to. We should reform flood insurance, and we ought to. But we ain't getting there tomorrow, and they need this help yesterday. So I want just to say, as a Texan and as chairman of the Budget Committee, let's work to make sure the money goes where it needs to go. Let's make sure we offset it to the extent we can, but let's get the support out and get it out now. Mr. Chuck Edwards, we're behind you, and I yield 5 minutes, or the magic 5 minutes for this committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sitting here for the last couple hours, 3 hours, I can't help but think how I'm looking forward to next year when I'll get to have my picture taken with the Republicans and get moved up in the queue.
I did not think about
a little
that.
bit. Yeah.
We will welcome you back to the Republican side.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Walker, in your testimony, you referenced the mounting debt ceiling and Congress's failure to constrain our spending over time. While you point to a constitutional amendment as a potential solution, I find the greatest contributor to our out-of-control spending is a lack of accountability in our current budget process. It's hard to imagine what $6 trillion looks like, especially if that funding is packaged together instead of passed as 12 standalone bills. In addition, the debt ceiling is only addressed on an as-needed basis, so members could go for multiple terms or retire without having to raise the ceiling for their previous spending decisions. Ultimately, members of Congress are able to vote for high spending packages with few repercussions from the American people. What is the arguments for and against tying the debt ceiling to the appropriations process to improve accountability of Congress?
Well, first, let me tell you, I think the debt ceiling is a dismal failure. We're the only major country on earth that has a nominal debt ceiling. It hasn't constrained spending. It hasn't constrained mounting debt levels. It ought to be repealed, and it ought to be replaced with a constitutional amendment that focuses on what matters the most. How much debt do you have as a percentage of the economy? And why do I say that? Because it's pro-growth, because if you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, you're making progress, even if the numerator is going up. By the way, that's what we did after World War II, okay? And secondly, it doesn't tell the Congress how to solve the numerator problem. It doesn't say how much of it is mandatory spending, how much of it is discretionary spending, how much of it is revenue. You're gonna have to do all of that, okay? It doesn't tell you how to do that, but it says you just gotta do it. And if you don't do it, there's a consequence. So, you know, we need more fundamental reform in this area, including understanding the difference between capital budgets and operating budgets, you know, including needing to pass the budgets on time, the appropriations on time. I'm 73 years old, although my doctor tells me I'm more like 53. I hope she's right. You know, the fact is you know how many times in my lifetime we've passed all the appropriations bills on time? 4. It's an F minus.
And so I think I hear you saying we should just eliminate the debt ceiling argument.
But you have to replace it. You have to replace it. You know, the debt ceiling was supposed to constrain debt, right? And by the way, it goes all the way back to World War I, where we started having a problem, you know. But now it doesn't do that. It's a political football. It doesn't do anything at all. So we need to have something that will stand the test of time. The debt break in Switzerland's a good example. There's several positive examples. But what really matters is how much debt as a percentage of the economy, how much interest as a percent of the budget, what percentage of the budget is mandatory. Last thing on this, in 1913, you know what percentage of the budget was mandatory? 3%. And you know what that was? Interest on the debt. That was it. Now it's 73. Mandatory.
Thank you for that. I'd like to get to at least one more question.
Yes,
Ms.,
sir. Sorry. Apologize.
Boccia?
Boccia.
Boccia, okay. I have the distinct pleasure of serving on the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee. I've been on the Appropriations Committee for about a year now. One of my particular frustrations, while I believe that the Appropriations Committees, the various subcommittees, are ultimately the folks that can best hold federal agencies accountable for their spending, I find it frustrating with two-year terms and oversight meetings where every member gets a chance to quiz an agency leader for 5 minutes to really hold folks accountable. It seems to me like many times the agency heads are sitting before the members and they're thinking, as long as I can get through this 5 minutes, I'm okay. I'm good for 2 more years, there'll be another Congress. Do you have any thoughts about that or any ideas how we can hold the federal agencies more accountable for the spending? I know Congress appropriates it, but there's a lot of decisions made inside that appropriation.
Congress needs to work with these agencies throughout the year, not just in those hearings, and needs to heed especially the recommendations of the Government Accountability Office, which does the heavy lifting of figuring out where there are problems with accountability and transparency and what systems need to be upgraded so Congress has more insight into what's happening there, and also demanding more reporting, especially on emergency spending, which is still very much obscure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I could go on for a long time, but I'm out of time, so I yield.
I thank the gentleman from the great state of North Carolina. Again, our prayers are with you and your friends and family back home. Mr. Rudy Yakum.
Mr. Chair, can I just have one?
Absolutely.
I heard somebody a while ago refer to, in their comments on disaster relief, referring to folks affected by the storm as coastal elites. I represent a district of 783,000 people, every one of which was affected severely by Hurricane Helene. Not one of them would I consider a coastal elite. Thank you. I yield.
I appreciate that notable correction of the record, so to speak. Mr. Rudy Yakum, 5 minutes for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and as well as for our witnesses for being here. As we discussed many times in this committee, our nation is on an unsustainable fiscal path. Our national debt currently sits at $36.2 trillion, or over 123% of GDP. Over the next decade, the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, projects that this figure will balloon to $56.8 trillion, or over 137% of GDP. Our out-of-control spending habits are harmful to our economy and to future generations. Reining in our nation's debt crisis is one of the main drivers behind my decision to run for Congress, which is why the first bill I introduced as a member of the House was a balanced budget amendment. Currently, 41 of our 50 states, including Indiana, require the governor to sign a balanced budget. And the Hoosier families that I represent develop a household budget aligned with their income and expenses. Why wouldn't they expect their federal government to do the same? I've said many times over the various hearings we've had in this Congress that we do not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. We need to focus on reining in wasteful spending, implementing pro-growth policies, and getting our fiscal house in order. My first question goes to Mr. Walker and Mr. Couchman. You've both been vocal supporters of the U.S. adopting a fiscal responsibility or balanced budget amendment. What would your ideal structure of an amendment be? Mr. Walker, we'll start with you.
Well, I think you can look at experiences of other countries, Switzerland in particular with the debt break. I think you can look at certain states like Colorado, the state of Colorado with their Tabor Amendment. But again, I come back, what we need to focus on is a reasonable level of debt to GDP. I would respectfully suggest we're too high already. As you properly point out, we're headed a lot higher. So we need to not only stabilize it, but we frankly need to reduce it to a reasonable level over the next 10 to 15 years. One last thing. Let me tell you what Congress needs to focus on. Outcomes. When you're doing authorization, reauthorization, appropriations, oversight, why did we set up this department or agency? Why did we create this program? Why did we create this tax preference? What were we trying to accomplish? How do we measure that in outcomes? And then how are they doing? Guess what? A vast majority of them have no idea because they haven't defined what the desired outcomes are. That would be a huge behavioral change.
Thank you. Mr. Couchman.
Thank you, Mr. Yocum. The fundamental parameters for a balanced budget amendment itself must reflect those that can pass the Congress, or if there's a convention that, it's 2/3 in both houses. So you need to have a good chunk of Republicans, a good chunk of Democrats in order to make that happen. There's two that I highlighted in my testimony, one by Chairman Arrington and one by Mr. Moran from the other side of Texas. The business cycle balanced budget amendment, where it's specific about how to go about doing that, and the principles-based balanced budget amendment with Senator Braun to set a principle in the Constitution that Congress, especially this committee, can write implementing legislation for. And there's a piece of legislation called the Responsible Budget Targets Act by Senator Braun and Whip Emmer that could be a really important core of that legislation. And I mentioned legislation because the Constitution, it's very vague. It's principles. It doesn't really give you a whole lot of clarity about what most things are. So you need to have a house built on the constitutional foundation in order to have something you can live with. And part of that is what I talked about with Mr. Moore, the comprehensive budget that gets all the committees involved in managing everything. Part of that is not having shutdowns anymore. We didn't have them before Jimmy Carter's Attorney General reinterpreted the Anti-Deficiency Act. Part of it is getting the process started on time, and Mr. Carter has an excellent bill to do that. There are other pieces, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Ms. Boccia, at what point do you believe that our debt will become insurmountable?
I think that our debt is already an excessive burden on the American economy. Nobody knows when it will become insurmountable. We have some projections, including from Penn Wharton, that suggest that our fiscal space will run out in about 15 years. But all of that is subject to investor sentiment, what happens with other currencies that could be competitors to the US dollar, and we should not want to find out where that threshold is by rushing over it. And the conversations we're having in this hearing today could put the fiscal brakes on it to make sure we don't find out the hard way.
And as you talked about what happens in 15 years when we cross that point, talk to us about what would the impact be on our economy if and when that happens?
If we suffered a severe fiscal crisis where investors lost confidence in the US government's willingness or ability to service the debt, we would suffer severe increases in interest rates and the potential of hyperinflation. I know that scenarios like those experienced by Venezuela and Argentina can seem very far-fetched, but they are not in the realm of the impossible if we continue on our reckless and unsustainable trajectory.
There are huge threats to our security and to democracy itself in that scenario as well.
Two things real quick. Only God knows when that day comes, and God's not telling us, but we're tempting fate. And secondly, the answer is, what would the impact be? Global depression.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you again to our witnesses for being here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I do yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana and closing us out, cleanup batter, and a guy we're going to miss a whole lot from Colorado, Mr. Greg Lopez, for 5 minutes.
Being here today. You know, in my short time here in Congress, I've recognized that the national debt is the biggest issue we must face. So much that I carry the national debt to show people when I'm out in my district, and people are appalled. You know, Mr. Walker, I did read your statement that you submitted, and you're right. Colorado did do something because we saw it come in 1992. The Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which allows, because we didn't trust government, we didn't trust that they were going to use our money correctly, we instilled a cap And I think this is a good example of what, when there's a will, there's a way. You can actually do it. But I sit here and I feel that both sides of the aisle seem to be a little tone deaf. They're not really focusing on the issue. They keep pointing fingers back and forth about taxes, about what we could do. Here's the facts that I think everybody needs to know, and specifically the American people. The national debt equates to 107, if you were gonna pay it, it would cost a person $107,594. Per household, it would be $272,546, and per child, it would be $498,233 per child. The federal government borrows $76,032 per second, as you can see by my debt clock. And so the United States gross debt currently exceed World War II levels. And so you're right, in the last 40 years, we've only passed 4 budgets, right? And it's interesting because you're supposed to have the House and the Senate take care of the purse and take care of the American people. And yet we pass these omnibus bills and we pass continued resolutions, which I am not a strong supporter of. But this is what gives us in the situations that we're in. We talk about fraud, waste, and abuse programs that are no longer authorized, right? The zombie programs, over 1,200 programs that have been no longer authorized or allowed should be funded, and yet we're funding them to the tune of $516 billion every single year. I'm at a loss as to why Congress cannot basically do what its job is, and that is do a budget, do it correctly, and I think it's important for us to recognize that, while everybody in Congress would like to go home for the holidays because everybody wants to spend Christmas, I try to remind my colleagues that we have men and women in uniform that took the same oath of office that we did, and they're not going to be home with their families because their duty comes first to their nation. We have a duty, we have a responsibility. We should not be worried about going home. We should not be worried about a holiday in the calendar. We have a duty and responsibility for the American people to make sure that we maintain the good balance in the budget. I think the people deserve problem solvers, not problem observers. And unfortunately, I see that in Congress today. But I have hope. I have hope that the 119th Congress will step up. They will step up to the plate. They will get a bloody nose. They will take a busted lip. They will get a black eye because they're doing it for the right reasons. We must stand in the gap. Fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government is something that is rampant. As a former director of the United States Small Business Administration in Colorado, I can assure you there is a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse. And like you, Mr. Walker, it took a lot of work to make sure that that office was efficient and it wasn't wasting money. But it can be done. If we have strong people, it can be done. Now, my question, Mr. Elmendorf, full disclosure, I don't have a lot of faith in the CBO these days because they came and they weren't able to answer my questions as it pertains to, but as a former director of CBO, what is the cost of illegal immigration to the American taxpayer?
Well, Congressman, thank you for the questions. Let me say first, I'm sorry you don't have confidence in CBO. I believe that you should, and I would be happy to explain.
I would
why
love that conversation.
offline, so please let us do that. The cost to the American taxpayer of immigration, legal and illegal, it can be seen both in the federal budget and in state and local budgets, and then in the economy more generally. What CBO has shown in a recent analysis is that the surge of immigration over the last few years is making the federal budget stronger over the coming decade because the immigrants are paying taxes in many cases and not receiving benefits in most cases.
Well,
That's not a full assessment, and CBO doesn't mean it to be a full assessment of the overall impact. It's just the direct impact.
Well, let me give you some different numbers. The Center for Immigration Study puts the cost per taxpayer at $68,000 over the lifetime of a illegal immigrant. The center also states that 4 million children of illegal immigrants cost taxpayers $68 billion in costs for public education. The Federation of American Immigration Reform puts a conservative estimate of the cumulative cost of illegal immigration to be $150 billion. Wouldn't you agree that it would be important for CBO to present those numbers in front of the Budget Committee?
I don't want to prescribe to my successor and his colleagues. As you know, CBO focuses on the federal budget. They have expertise at that. Some of the key numbers you mentioned, the extra cost of public education, borne by state and local governments. So I would hope the CBO could provide information about that, but I don't know, as an ex-member, what the state of their knowledge and analysis of.
Well, unfortunately, I can tell you that their numbers for the last 7 years have been off, and that's where I lose confidence. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I agree, there've been too many examples. $1 trillion off on a deficit projection, 1 trillion. Look, it's hard to predict the future in any scenario, and certainly over the last few years, I would suggest, because of a lot of the executive actions, but we can and must do better. I couldn't agree more with Mr. Lopez. Thank you all. Again, it's been a great conversation, a great day for America that we're having it. I hate to say that the bar's low that we're having the conversation and that success, but in this town, if it's an honest conversation, it is unique and it is a success. But to my colleagues' comments, we need to be problem solvers, not observers, and at some point, we're going to have to take action. Both sides in their own, with their own leadership authority and responsibility when they have the gavels and the majority, and then both sides together in that same scenario where we can. So thank you for your commitment to this common cause of ours, to restore fiscal sanity in this town and save our country from a debt-related crisis. Mr. Walker, Ms. Boccia, Mr. Couchman, Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your service to our country. I'm going to give the last word to my Democrat friend, which makes me really nervous, but I'm going to do it, and then we're going to close it out. Mr. Scott?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for a serious conversation about the budget. As you have suggested, these kinds of conversations are rare, and you've got really knowledgeable experts. I've worked with the two on each end during my career, and they've both made major contributions. But I have to take issue with both sides, because every Democratic presidential administration since Kennedy has left for their Republican successors a better deficit situation than they inherited, without exception. And every Republican since Nixon, their administration has left for their Democratic successors a worse deficit situation, again, without exception. And we can fix this. We did it during the Clinton budget, and I think I'm the only one on the committee that actually voted on the Clinton budget, for the Clinton budget, and it showed that it can be done. Only Democratic votes in the House and Senate. And I regrettably, when Marjorie McGoldrick cast the 218th vote, she wasn't applauded for congratulating, now we've got a great budget that's going to get us into surplus. No, the chant went bye-bye Marjorie, and she was defeated in the next election. But one of the things that I think can be most helpful is pay-go, and you see the difference in the two sides on pay-go. Democrats, if you have a new spending plan, you have to pay for it. You have to either come up with spending cuts to pay for it or new taxes to pay for it. If you have a tax cut, you've got to either spending cuts or other taxes to pay for the tax cuts, called pay-go. Under Republicans, you have this cut-go. If you have a new spending plan, you have to pay for it, either cut spending or new taxes, but tax cuts don't have to be paid for. I mean, what could go wrong? Maybe the massive deficit-causing tax cuts that over the years that have caused all of those problems. But I think it's just a different, it shows why there's a difference in administration. But getting the budget under control isn't going to be easy. Not until members are willing to cast difficult votes like Democrats did in 1993. Progress will not be made, but I look forward to budget proposals that will not just offer procedure, but offer the actual ability to address the deficit. And Mr. Chairman, your leadership and substance, I think we may be able to get there, and look forward to it.
I thank my friend and again, appreciate his leadership and service, and let's continue the conversation, and this, I'm supposed to give a formal deal. Let's see here. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and answers may be made part of the formal record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days, and with that, we're adjourned.